HOA Karen stole my driveway, so I gave her a parking lesson she'd never forget. The morning I came home to find an orange construction cone and a laminated HOA sign planted dead center in my own driveway, I stood there with my groceries going warm in the Texas sun, blinking like I'd missed something critical, like maybe I'd died and woken up in someone else's life. My neighbor Linda Marsh, HOA president, self-appointed neighborhood sheriff, the woman who once fined a family for the wrong shade of beige on their mailbox, was standing on her porch with a smirk that could curdle milk, watching me with her arms folded like she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. She called across the lawn, "Cool as you please. That easement has been reclassified as community access property, Marcus. You'll want to read the updated bylaws I emailed at 6 a.m. I looked at my driveway that I'd poured money into repaving last spring, and I thought, okay, Linda, you want to play? Let's play. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've lived at 14 Clover Ridge Lane in Millfield Estates, Austin, Texas for going on 7 years. I bought this house at 31, single, proud, a little terrified, with money I'd saved for a decade working in IT infrastructure. It's a modest place. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, a driveway I widened myself so my truck and my mom's sedan could fit side by side when she visited. Mom started driving out from San Antonio every other weekend after Dad passed. She's 68, her hip's been bad since the fall, and the extra-wide driveway meant she didn't have to park on the street and walk the incline. It wasn't luxury, it was logistics. It was love made practical. I kept to myself mostly, said good morning, put my trash bins out on time, kept the lawn edged. Millfield Estates had an HOA sure, and I paid my dues without complaint. I thought it was just a formality, a background hum you ignored. I did not yet understand what Linda Marsh could do when she decided to notice you. Linda Marsh moved into the neighborhood 3 years after me, and inside 6 months she'd run for HOA president on a platform of protecting property values and community standards. She won barely because most of us didn't vote. I remember thinking, fine, someone has to do it. I put my ballot in the recycling without filling it out. That's on me. In her first year, Linda was merely annoying. She sent newsletters with bolded warnings about unapproved lawn ornaments and non-compliant holiday lighting. She showed up at the Delgados' door to photograph their wind chimes. She issued a formal notice to old Mr. Peterson because his welcome mat was, and I quote, not a neutral tone consistent with HOA aesthetic guidelines. But she also got the common area repainted, fixed the broken gate at the entrance, and negotiated a better landscaping contract. So people tolerated her, even praised her. She was the kind of person who got things done by making everything about those things feel urgent and deeply personal, and who was always just helpful enough that calling her out felt ungrateful. I had my first real run-in with Linda in my 4th year on Clover Ridge Lane. I'd parked my truck halfway in the street one Saturday afternoon while I unloaded lumber for a deck project. She materialized on my lawn. No knock, no call. Clipboard in hand, already writing. "You're blocking part of the street easement, Marcus," she said, not looking up. HOA Code 4.7b. I'll need to issue a formal notice. I told her I'd be unloaded in 20 minutes. She said, policy doesn't have a 20-minute grace period. She sent the notice anyway. $42. I paid it. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. That was my first mistake, letting her learn that I was the kind of person who paid fines and went quiet. People like Linda catalog that. They remember who bends. Over the next year, I watched her consolidate power in ways I didn't fully register at the time. She got her friend Diane elected as HOA secretary. She recruited Tom Albright, a retired city zoning official who golfed with her husband, onto the Architectural Review Board. She rewrote the bylaws committee to give the president emergency authority, to interpret HOA codes between board meetings. That last one passed at a meeting attended by 11 people, including 3 who were Linda's direct friends. I wasn't there. I was in Denver for work. I found out about it 3 months later when she used it to fine the Nguyen's $200 for painting their front door a color she called excessively saturated. The Nguyen's door was olive green. It was a beautiful, calm, perfectly normal color. Mrs. Nguyen cried on her own front step when she got the fine. I saw it from across the street. That was the moment I started to pay attention. I started attending HOA meetings. I started reading the bylaws. I started talking to neighbors, really talking, not just waving. What I found was a patchwork of small humiliations. A fine here, a warning letter there. A phone call that felt just barely within the bounds of what was okay but left you feeling watched and vaguely ashamed for no reason you could name. Linda was strategic about it. She never targeted people randomly. She went after the ones who couldn't easily fight back. Renters, newcomers, people with jobs that left no time for HOA meetings, people like the Nguyens who were conflict-averse by nature and culture. She built loyalty in the rest through flattery and small favors. A variance approved here, a violation waived there, always with the unspoken understanding of what that loyalty was worth. She also, I noticed, never once issued a fine to anyone on Birchwood Court, the cul-de-sac where her closest allies lived. Tom Albright's driveway had a crack in it wide enough to lose a bicycle. Diane's lawn had a dead patch the size of a kiddie pool from July to September. Linda called these things under review. They stayed under review indefinitely. By the time I started paying attention, Linda had been president for 2 years and had turned the HOA into a minor fiefdom. She controlled the budget, the communications, and the interpretation of every rule. She'd also, I would later learn, been quietly collecting information about residents, about properties, about any legal or financial details she could use as leverage. I didn't know that yet. In the fall of my 6th year at Clover Ridge Lane, I just knew she was a bully running a neighborhood association, and I was getting tired of watching her do it unchallenged. The driveway conflict started, indirectly, with my truck. I drive a full-size Chevy Silverado, not oversized, not commercial, just a regular pickup truck. I need it for hauling things, for camping trips, for the occasional help-a-friend-move weekend. It fits fine in my driveway. It always had. In October of last year, Linda's husband Gary purchased a new boat. It was not a small boat. It was a 22-foot fishing vessel on a trailer, and Gary parked it on the street in front of their house, which is technically against HOA Code 7.3a. No recreational vehicles or trailers stored on public streets for more than 48 hours. It had been there 3 weeks when I noticed. I mentioned it at the November board meeting, not aggressively, just as a question. Was the boat going to be moved? Linda smiled and said it was temporarily on the approved storage exemption list, while they arranged alternative accommodations. I asked to see that list. She said it was an internal administrative document. I asked who had approved the exemption. She said the president had authority to issue temporary exemptions under the Emergency Powers Clause. I sat with that for a week. Then I submitted a formal written inquiry requesting the legal basis for a standing, temporary exemption that had lasted over a month. Linda responded with a 3-paragraph letter that said, essentially, that the matter was resolved to the board's satisfaction and she considered it closed. She CC'd Diane and Tom. The boat stayed. I started keeping notes after that. Dates, incidents, names, fine amounts, which properties were cited and which weren't. I wasn't sure what I was building toward yet. I'm not a litigious person by nature. But something in me had gone quiet and purposeful, the way it does when I'm deep in a technical problem at work. Patient, systematic, not angry exactly, just focused. My mom noticed it when she visited in December. We were sitting on the porch with coffee and she said, "Marcus, you've got that look." I said, "What look?" She said, "The look you had when you were 12 and Derek Mills kept stealing your lunch, right before you stopped letting him." I told her it was fine. She patted my hand and said, "Hum." What I didn't tell her, what I barely admitted to myself, was that the thing Linda had done to the Nguyen's still sat in me like a splinter. Mrs. Nguyen crying on her own steps over a door she'd painted with her own hands in her own house. That image didn't leave. It just waited. In January, Linda sent a neighborhood-wide email about upcoming easement clarifications that she said were part of a routine legal review. The email was long and technical, and most people deleted it. I read it 3 times. One line buried in paragraph 6 mentioned that private driveway aprons adjoining shared easement corridors may be subject to reclassification based on updated municipal assessments. I printed it out and highlighted that sentence. I called a real estate attorney friend of mine, Priya Osei, who'd helped me with the original purchase, and read her the line. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Marcus, what exactly is the layout of your driveway relative to the street?" I described it. She said, "Send me your property survey and the HOA bylaws. I want to look at something." That was January 14th. Priya called me back on January 20th. She'd found something. My driveway widening, the section I'd added on the left side to accommodate my mom's car, was built on what the county had technically recorded as a shared utility easement strip. Not a sidewalk, not a street, not anyone else's property. A utility easement, meaning the county had a right-of-way for underground pipes, but otherwise it was functionally mine. Priya said it was a gray area, but that an HOA with a creative interpretation of its bylaws and a sympathetic reading of the municipal code could potentially argue for access rights to that strip. "It's a stretch," she said, "but it's not nothing." I sat on that information for a week, trying to decide if I was being paranoid. Then, on February 3rd, Linda knocked on my door. She was dressed nicely, blazer, pressed slacks, the full HOA president costume, and she had a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she wanted to discuss something as neighbors, informally, before it became a formal matter. She told me she'd had a legal review done of easement boundaries in the neighborhood as part of a broader infrastructure planning initiative. She said my driveway expansion appeared to encroach on a shared utility corridor, and that the HOA was considering formally designating that strip as community access property. She slid a folded document across my kitchen table. It was a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. I looked at the letter. It cited 3 sections of the county municipal code and 2 HOA bylaw provisions. It was thorough. It was also, I noticed, dated December 28th, 3 weeks before Linda had sent her routine email about easement clarifications. She'd had this ready before she even told the neighborhood there was a review happening. "What does community access property mean in practice?" I asked. She smiled wider. "It would mean the HOA maintains the right to use that corridor for community purposes. Parking primarily, given the layout. We've been exploring using it to ease guest parking congestion near the front entrance." I kept my voice flat. "So you want to park cars in my driveway?" She tilted her head. "In the easement strip, which isn't technically your driveway, Marcus." I told her I'd need time to review the documents. She said, of course, take all the time I needed, but that the board was meeting in 3 weeks and would appreciate a response before then. She stood up, smoothed her blazer, and said, "I hope we can handle this neighborly. I'd hate for it to get complicated." Then she left. I called Priya before Linda's car had even left the block. I read her the letter. There was a long pause. Then Priya said, "Okay, so she did it. The legal argument is still a stretch, but she's got a firm behind her, and if you don't respond formally, she can move forward administratively, and it becomes a lot harder to undo. We need to respond." "How fast?" "Fast," she said. "And Marcus?" Don't let them park anything in that strip. Once they establish use, it complicates the claim. I spent that weekend at my kitchen table going through 7 years of HOA records I'd pulled from their website and from the county's public database. Priya had told me what to look for. Any prior easement reclassifications, any precedent for the HOA claiming access to private driveway aprons, any inconsistencies in how the emergency powers clause had been applied. I found inconsistencies. A lot of them. The emergency powers clause had been invoked 14 times in 2 years. 11 of those times, the invocation benefited either Linda, her allies, or properties owned by people who donated to the HOA's Neighborhood Improvement Fund, a discretionary account that Linda controlled. 3 of those invo actions had been used to waive violations for Tom Albright. I also found something I hadn't expected. A bylaw amendment that Linda had pushed through in her first year. One that changed the process for easement reclassification. Originally, reclassification required a 2/3 vote of all HOA members. Linda's amendment reduced that to a simple majority of the board. The board had 5 members. Linda, Diane, and Tom were 3 of them. The math was ugly. She'd given herself and 2 allies the unilateral power to reclassify any property easement in the neighborhood. And now she was using it on me. I sent Priya the documents on Sunday night. She called me Monday morning. "This is worse than I thought," she said, and I could hear her clicking through files. The bylaw amendment. Was there a member vote on that? I checked my notes. The record says it was passed by the board under emergency authority because time-sensitive legal compliance requirements demanded immediate action. What legal requirements? There's no further detail in the record. Another pause. Marcus, I think she manufactured the compliance emergency to bypass the member vote requirement. If that's true, the amendment itself may be invalid. If it's invalid, I said slowly, then the easement reclassification also can't proceed the way she's doing it. Not legally, no. She'd need a 2/3 member vote, which she almost certainly wouldn't get. I looked out my kitchen window at my driveway, at the spot where my mom parked. What do? We write a very polite, very thorough, very formally documented response letter, Priya said, and we CC the county, the state HOA regulatory office, and every board member individually. And then we wait to see who blinks. We sent the letter on February 17th. It was 8 pages. It requested formally full documentation of the legal review process, the name and engagement letter of the law firm Linda had hired, and confirmation that HOA funds, not Linda's personal funds, had paid for it. The emergency authority invocation records for all 14 uses of the clause, and a legal opinion on the validity of the bylaw amendment given the lack of member vote. Linda did not respond for 10 days. When she did, the response came from the law firm, not from her directly. The letter was shorter and colder. It acknowledged my concerns, stated that all HOA actions had been conducted in full compliance with the bylaws as currently adopted, and advised that the easement reclassification process would proceed on the original timeline. It did not answer a single one of our 8 specific requests. I showed the response to Priya. She read it twice and then said, "She's gambling that you'll back down, or that the process will be slow enough that she gets the reclassification through before you can stop it." Can she? If she moves the board meeting up, maybe. The notice requirements for an emergency session are only 72 hours. She could call one and vote it through before you even get a lawyer on record. So what do? We file with the state HOA Regulatory Commission today, and we send a copy to every resident in the neighborhood. The state filing stopped the clock. Texas has a regulatory body, the Texas Real Estate Commission, with an HOA dispute division that requires associations to pause contested administrative actions pending review. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it bought time. and sending copies to every resident was, I'll admit, a calculated move. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I was trying to make sure that whatever happened next, people knew about it. The neighborhood response surprised me. I'd expected silence or mild sympathy. What I got was 12 emails in 48 hours. From the Nguyen's, from the Pedersens, from a couple on Maple Terrace whose fence variance had been mysteriously denied. From a woman named Brenda Howell who said Linda had threatened to call code enforcement on her vegetable garden. And from 4 other people I'd barely spoken to. Every one of them had a story. Every one of them had been sitting quietly with it. I started a group text thread, then a shared folder on Google Drive with documented incidents, dates, and any correspondence they'd saved. It was informal and scrappy, and I wasn't sure what we were building exactly. But it was something. It was people who'd been picked off individually, one by one, finally in the same room talking. Even if the room was digital. Linda noticed. Of course she did. She sent a neighborhood-wide email 2 days later. Calm, professional, dripping with concern. Explaining that she'd received troubling reports of a coordinated misinformation campaign about HOA operations. She said she wanted to transparently address any confusion and invited residents to a special informational session at the community clubhouse the following Saturday. She did not mention my name. She didn't have to. I went to the meeting, so did about 40 other residents. More than had attended any HOA meeting in years. Linda stood at the front of the room in her blazer and pearls, with a PowerPoint presentation titled, Protecting Our Community. The facts. She had charts showing how property values had increased since her presidency. She had a slide about the legal complexities of easement management. She had a slide, I noticed, that was titled The Dangers of Misinformation, and it had a photo of a neighborhood in decline, houses with peeling paint and overgrown yards, used as a visual warning about what happened when community governance broke down. She didn't accuse me of anything directly. She spoke in the passive voice of institutional authority. Concerns have been raised. Certain individuals have chosen. Misinformation can damage what we've all worked hard to build. She was skilled. I'll give her that. In a room full of people who hadn't been paying attention, it could have worked. But some of those people had been paying attention. Brenda Howell raised her hand and asked, very politely, about the vegetable garden warning letter she'd received. Linda said that was a specific matter being handled through proper channels, and not appropriate to discuss publicly. James Nguyen asked about the olive green door fine. Linda said the board had acted within its authority. Tom Peterson asked why his fence variance had been pending for 8 months with no response. Linda said the architectural review process takes time when done correctly. She answered nothing, but she answered it all so smoothly, so reasonably, with such practiced concern on her face, that half the room seemed to settle. I watched it happen. The moment when maybe she has a point crossed the faces of people who'd come in skeptical. It was like watching someone let air out of a tire, slow and deliberate. Linda was very, very good at this. After the meeting, she stopped me in the parking lot. Just the 2 of us, the other residents filing to their cars. Dusk coming down orange and warm over the neighborhood. She said quietly, I hope you got what you needed tonight, Marcus. I said, I think I did. She smiled, and this time it did reach her eyes, but not in a warm way. In the way of someone who's just reminded you of how the board is stacked. The morning after Linda's meeting, I woke up to find a bright orange construction cone and a laminated HOA sign planted in the left section of my driveway, the widened strip where my mom parked. The sign read, Community Easement Area, NO Private Vehicle Storage, HOA Code 12.1. There was a small zip-tied tag on the cone. Posted pursuant to Board Emergency Session, February 28th. Contact HOA Administration with questions. She'd called an emergency session. She'd done it the night of her own meeting, probably while I was still driving home. 72-hour notice to board members only, no member vote required. She'd passed the easement reclassification in a 3-2 vote. Linda, Diane, Tom in favor, the two other board members, a retired teacher named Carol Sims and a young engineer named Derek Park, voting no. It was done. I photographed everything. The cone, the sign, the tag, my driveway, the property line markers. I sent the photos to Priya before I'd even gone back inside. Then I did something that felt important. I moved the cone. Carefully, deliberately, I picked it up and set it on the sidewalk, and I parked my truck in my driveway exactly where I always parked it. Within 2 hours, Linda was at my door. She had her phone out, already recording. "Marcus, you've removed HOA posted markers from a designated community easement. That's a violation of Code 12.1 and potentially interference with community property. I'm documenting this," I said, calmly, looking directly at her phone camera. "Linda, that strip of driveway is my private property. The reclassification was conducted without a valid member vote as required by the original bylaw. I filed with the State Regulatory Commission, and I will not be removing my vehicle." She blinked. The camera kept rolling. "The board has authority. The board amended its own authority through an emergency clause that may itself be invalid. My attorney has that on record. Do you want me to send you her contact information?" Linda's smile tightened. She lowered her phone. "You'll be fined. Then I'll contest every fine through the regulatory process. Have a good morning, Linda." She fined me $150 that afternoon. I contested it that evening via the state filing. She fined me another $150 the next morning for continued violation. I contested that too. She sent a formal letter saying she was referring the matter to the HOA's legal counsel for escalated enforcement action. I forwarded it to Priya, who forwarded it to the State Commission. We were in a bureaucratic war of attrition, and I had the stamina for it. What Linda hadn't counted on, what I don't think she'd modeled in her calculations, was that I worked in IT infrastructure. I am professionally, constitutionally patient with systems. I debug things that take weeks to resolve. I maintain documentation the way other people breathe. I had a spreadsheet tracking every fine, every filing date, every response deadline. I had calendar alerts for every regulatory window. This was not a thing she could outlast through paperwork. But she tried other angles. The week after the cone incident, I found a note on my windshield. Not from Linda directly. No signature, just printed text, suggesting I consider the financial and legal costs of continuing to fight the association. The note said that settlements are available to those who act in good faith before matters escalate. I photographed it and added it to my file. No signature meant nothing legally, but I knew. 2 days later, the HOA's landscaping crew, which Linda personally coordinated, showed up and trimmed the hedge along my property line in a way that removed about 18 inches of buffer on the easement strip side. They left the clippings on my driveway. I documented it, said nothing, cleaned it up myself. Poke and retreat. She was testing my reactions, seeing what would make me blow up or back down. I did neither. I went to Carol Sims, one of the two board members who'd voted no, and asked if she'd be willing to talk. Carol was a 64-year-old former high school principal who'd been on the HOA board for 5 years. She was measured and careful, but she agreed to coffee. Over 2 hours, she laid out, quietly and precisely, everything she'd witnessed from inside the board. The manufactured emergency sessions, the financial irregularities in the improvement fund, the social pressure Linda applied to board members who didn't fall in line, the way Tom Albright functioned as a rubber stamp. "Why haven't you said anything publicly?" I asked. Carol wrapped her hands around her mug. Because I have 4 more years of living in this neighborhood. And I know what she does to people who cross her openly. She paused. But I'm tired of it, Marcus. I'm very tired of it. I asked if she'd be willing to go on record, not publicly, not yet, but in a written statement for the Regulatory Commission. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said yes. Derek Park, the other dissenting board member, was easier to reach. He was 31, an engineer at a tech firm downtown, and he joined the board thinking he could modernize HOA operations. He'd figured out Linda's game within his first 3 months and had been looking for a way out that didn't involve blowing up his property values. When I sat down with him, he had a thumb drive. I kept copies, he said, of everything. I stared at him. Everything. Everything she asked the board to sign. Every emergency invocation. Every financial authorization. I thought someone might need it eventually. He slid the drive across the table. I took the drive home and plugged it in that night. It was meticulous. Derek was an engineer, after all. 47 documents, sorted by date and type. Board meeting minutes, financial transfers, legal invoices, internal emails between Linda, Diane, and Tom. I read for 4 hours straight. By midnight, I had a list of 17 things that looked, to my non-lawyer eyes, genuinely problematic. I sent the list to Priya. I sent the drive's contents to Priya. I went to bed at 1 a.m. feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Like the ground under me was solid again. Priya called at 8 the next morning. Marcus, some of this is administrative sloppiness. Some of it is borderline. But 3 of these items are not borderline. They're serious. She paused. The improvement fund. Do you see the transfers on November 15th and December 3rd? I had them pulled up already. Yes. Those funds went to a company called LM Property Solutions. Do you know who owns LM Property Solutions? I didn't. She told me. Linda Marsh. She'd contracted her own company to provide property assessment services for the HOA, using HOA funds, without disclosing her ownership stake to the board. It was a self-dealing violation under Texas nonprofit law. It was not a gray area. I sat very still for a moment. Then I asked, how much? The 2 transfers total $8,400. $8,400. From the HOA Improvement Fund. Money paid by every resident in the neighborhood, including the Nguyen's, including Brenda Howell, including the elderly Mr. Peterson who'd been fined for his welcome mat, to a company that Linda secretly owned. I exhaled slowly. Priya, what does this mean? It means we're not just fighting an easement dispute anymore, she said. This is financial fraud. We didn't move immediately. Priya was careful about that. If we go public with this before we've locked down the documentation, she'll lawyer up and start destroying records, she said. We file with the state AG's office and the county DA. We do it quietly, and we keep the Regulatory Commission case moving so she doesn't notice we've opened a second front. I agreed. I went back to being patient. I went back to my spreadsheet. But Linda was not standing still either. On March 12th, she filed a formal complaint with the City of Austin's Code Enforcement Division, claiming that my driveway expansion had been built without a proper permit. I pulled my original permits from when I did the work. I had them, of course I had them, I keep everything, and I submitted them to code enforcement within 48 hours. The complaint was closed. But it had cost me a half day of work and the anxiety of 36 hours not knowing if there was a problem. On March 19th, she contacted my HOA insurance carrier. She'd found the name from my original homeowner disclosure, required when I joined the HOA, and filed a claim asserting that my driveway encroachment was a liability issue that might affect the community's policy. My carrier called me, confused. I explained the situation. They closed it as unfounded. Linda had not expected that I would know my own policy. On March 25th, I got a call from a reporter at the Austin American-Statesman. She said she'd received a tip about a neighborhood dispute involving an HOA easement conflict and possible resident harassment. She wanted to comment from me. I asked her who the tip came from. She couldn't say, but she described the tip's framing, that a disgruntled resident was organizing opposition to legitimate HOA governance. I knew exactly whose framing that was. I told the reporter I'd be happy to speak with her, but that I had some documents she might find interesting. We set a time for later that week. Before I met with the reporter, I called a meeting of the neighborhood group that had been forming in the group text. 15 people came, in person, at my kitchen table and spilling into the living room. I told them where things stood, the regulatory filing, the financial documents, the code enforcement complaint, the insurance call, and now the press outreach. I laid it all out without drama. I told them, Linda is going to escalate. She's going to try to make this about me. My truck, my driveway, my campaign against the HOA. I need everyone in this room to decide whether they want to stand up or step back. Because once this goes public, it gets harder. Nobody left. Mrs. Nguyen said quietly, "We've been quiet long enough." Brenda Howell said, "I have every letter she sent me. Every one." Tom Peterson, who was 71 and didn't fully understand what a Google Drive was, but had printed out all his documents and brought them in a manila folder, set the folder on my coffee table and said, "Use whatever you need, son." I had to look at the ceiling for a moment, just to hold it together. The reporter's name was Camille Torres, and she was sharp. She spent 3 hours with me going through documents. She asked hard questions. She pushed back on my framing. She asked what my self-interest was in the dispute. She asked whether I'd followed proper HOA channels before going to the state. I appreciated it. I showed her everything and let her draw her own conclusions. Before she left, she said, "I'm going to need to reach out to Ms. Marsh for comment. That'll put her on notice that a story is coming." I said that was fine. I was ready. Linda's response to Camille's inquiry, which Camille shared with me off the record, was a 4-paragraph statement accusing me of bad faith interference with community governance, describing the easement reclassification as a routine administrative action, and calling the financial concerns mischaracterizations by individuals who do not understand nonprofit accounting. She did not deny that LM Property Solutions existed or that she owned it. She just called the characterization of its role inaccurate. That non-denial told me something important. She hadn't figured out exactly what we had yet. She was playing defense without knowing the shape of the attack. And Priya had by then confirmed that our filings with the state AG and county DA were received and assigned to case officers. The machinery was moving. All I had to do was keep the pressure steady and not give Linda anything dramatic to pivot off of. I focused on the practical things. I hired a licensed surveyor to remeasure my property lines and produce a formal survey map, which showed very clearly that the utility easement strip was functionally indistinct from my private driveway use area and that I had 7 years of established use. The surveyor's report became the cornerstone of the regulatory response. Priya filed it on April 1st. On April 4th, Linda showed up at my door again. No blazer this time. Just Linda in a fleece vest without her clipboard, which was, I realized immediately, unusual enough to be significant. She asked if she could come in. I said I'd rather talk on the porch. She sat in one of my porch chairs and looked, for the first time in this whole affair, slightly tired. "This is getting expensive for both of us," she said. I said, "Yes. I think there's a resolution here that doesn't require all this." "What kind of resolution?" She slid a paper across the small table. It was a draft agreement. She'd rescind the easement reclassification. I'd withdraw the regulatory filings and agree not to pursue further legal action related to HOA governance disputes. I read it twice. Then I said, "Linda, this agreement asks me to close my regulatory filings in exchange for getting back what was mine to begin with, and it would prevent me from pursuing any future claims, including ones that aren't about my driveway." She kept her face even. "It's a clean resolution." "It's not a resolution," I said. "It's a settlement that protects you, not the neighborhood." I handed the paper back. "I'm not signing this." She left. The tire look was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen on Linda Marsh's face before: calculation recalibrating. The next week was quiet in a way that made me nervous. No fines, no letters, no landscaping incidents. Linda posted a cheerful newsletter about the upcoming spring community cookout. She re-engaged on the neighborhood Facebook group with a warm post about exciting improvements coming to the common areas. She was being normal. She was doing it deliberately, and I didn't know why. I found out on April 18th, when Derek Park texted me at 6:45 a.m. Emergency board meeting called for tonight. Agenda says, architectural review policy updates. I don't know what that means, but she didn't tell me about it until an hour ago. 72-hour rule is satisfied technically since it's a 7 p.m. meeting. I looked at the timestamp. It was 6:47 a.m. The meeting had been noticed at 7 p.m. the previous evening. Exactly 72 hours, to the minute. I called Priya. She told me to get to that meeting. She may be trying to pass something preemptively, something that strengthens her position before the regulatory review concludes. Or she may be setting up another procedural move on the easement. Go and document everything. I rearranged my evening and went. The meeting room was set up differently than usual. Linda had brought in a projector. She had printed packets. Diane was there, Tom was there, Carol and Derek were there, and so were about 15 residents, more than usually came. Linda looked briefly surprised to see me, then smoothed it over with a practiced smile. The architectural review policy updates turned out to be a new policy granting the HOA authority to conduct annual property surveys to ensure ongoing compliance with community standards. The surveys would be conducted by an independent assessor hired by the board. The policy didn't name who the assessor would be, but it gave the board, Linda, the authority to choose. Priya had warned me about something like this, a structural power grab dressed as routine governance. I raised my hand. Linda acknowledged me with a look that said she'd been expecting this. "Who selects the independent assessor?" I asked. "The board," she said, "under existing procurement authority." "Is there a conflict of interest disclosure requirement?" She paused. "Board members are expected to recuse if conflicts exist." Expected to, not required to. Another pause. "The policy follows standard governance practice." I looked at Carol. Carol looked at her hands. I looked at Derek. He gave me the smallest possible nod. Derek moved to table the vote pending additional stakeholder input and legal review of conflict of interest provisions. Carol seconded. Linda called the vote. 3-2 against tabling. The policy passed. Linda moved on to the next agenda item before anyone could respond. The whole thing took 11 minutes. I walked to my car afterward with Brenda Howell at my side. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means she just gave herself authority to hire her own company to inspect everyone's property," I said. Again, Brenda was quiet for a moment. "Can she do that?" "She just did," I said. "But she won't get to use it, because by April 22nd, the Texas Real Estate Commission's HOA Dispute Division had completed its preliminary review of my filing and issued a formal inquiry notice to the Millfield Estates HOA. The notice required the HOA to produce all records related to the easement reclassification, all emergency authority invocations, and all financial transactions from the improvement fund for the past 3 years. Linda had 30 days to comply. She received the notice on a Thursday. I know this because Carol texted me. Tarisi letter arrived. She read it during lunch. She's been on the phone with the law firm for 2 hours. That evening, Linda posted in the neighborhood Facebook group, not a newsletter, just a post, informal, which was new. Our HOA is cooperating fully with a routine state inquiry. These reviews are standard for associations our size. Everything is in order. It got 4 likes. 2 of them were Diane and Tom. The investigation was no longer just my dispute. It was official. It was documented. It had a case number. And Linda, for the first time since this started, didn't control the paperwork. There's a particular quality to the quiet that comes in the eye of something like this. Everything slows down on the surface, the fines stop, the letters stop, the neighborly provocations stop, and you'd almost think it was over if you didn't know better. I knew better. So I used the quiet to prepare. I had coffee with Priya twice a week during those 3 weeks. We reviewed the TREC response timeline, the parallel AG referral status, and the options for a potential civil claim if the financial fraud case moved forward. Priya was careful to remind me, every time, that these things took longer than anyone wanted. The law is very slow, she said. It's slow on purpose. Deliberateness is a feature, not a bug. I nodded. I kept my spreadsheet. My mom came to visit the second weekend of the quiet period. She knew about the situation in broad strokes. I'd been keeping her updated since February, but she didn't know the financial piece yet. I told her over dinner. She set her fork down very carefully and said, "She took money from the neighborhood fund? Appears so." Mom looked at her plate for a moment. Then she said, "Marcus, baby, you be careful. That kind of person doesn't lose gracefully." I told her I knew. She said, "I mean it. When cornered people like that do things that don't make sense." I filed that away. The neighborhood group stayed active during the quiet period, which surprised me. I'd half expected people to drift back to their routines once the immediate drama subsided. Instead, Brenda organized a shared spreadsheet of every HOA fine issued in the past 2 years, categorized by property, amount, and whether it was contested. What she and Mrs. Nguyen found, going through it systematically, was a pattern so clear it almost looked deliberate. Properties on 3 specific streets received 78% of all fines. Those streets had the highest proportion of non-white homeowners in the neighborhood. I looked at those numbers for a long time. I thought about Mrs. Nguyen on her steps. I thought about the Pedersens, who were white and elderly and had received almost no fines despite very visible violations. I thought about whether I'd been naive, whether what I'd been reading as petty power-grabbing was something uglier and more structured than that. I didn't have proof of intent. Disparate impact is hard to prove. But I sent the spreadsheet to Priya and asked her to think about it. Priya thought about it for 2 days and then said, "Marcus, this changes the scope of what we're looking at. If there's a Fair Housing Act angle here, we're talking federal, not state. Let me make some calls." I said okay. I stayed quiet about it. Some things you build carefully before you surface them. In the meantime, I fixed a broken step on my porch that I'd been putting off for months. I repotted some plants. I had dinner with Derek Park and we talked about things that had nothing to do with the HOA, his work, a road trip he was planning, a book we'd both read. It was good to be a person for an evening, not just a plaintiff. Carol Sims called me during the quiet period, on a Tuesday afternoon, from what sounded like her car. She spoke quietly. She said Linda had approached her, privately, and offered to support Carol's re-election to the board, active campaigning. The works, if Carol would come back to the team on the TREC matter. Carol said she'd told Linda she needed to think about it. She hadn't said yes. But she was telling me, so I knew. I thanked her. I asked what she was going to do. Carol was quiet for a moment and then said, "The right thing. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm just scared of what it costs." I told her I understood that completely. Linda, during this period, made one move I didn't fully register until later. She quietly transferred the domain registration of the official HOA website, milfieldestatishoa.com, into her personal email account. It was a technical detail buried in a maintenance notice she sent to Diane. Derek caught it only because he'd been CC'd by mistake. She's taking control of the communications infrastructure, he told me. If things go sideways, she controls what the neighborhood sees. I made a note. I didn't act on it yet, but I made a note. By May 1st, the quiet had stretched 3.5 weeks and I could feel it ending. Not from anything Linda had done, from the absence of what she wasn't doing. A person like Linda Marsh doesn't go quiet because she's defeated. She goes quiet because she's building something. I just didn't know yet what it was. The first sign that Linda had finished building was a certified letter that arrived on May 5th. Not from the HOA, not from her law firm, but from a company called Granite Crest Property Consultants, LLC. The letter informed me that Granite Crest had been retained on behalf of Millfield Estates HOA to conduct an independent structural and code compliance assessment of properties in the community, starting with mine. The inspection was scheduled for May 12th, between 9 and 11 a.m. Access to all exterior property areas, including driveway and easement zones, was requested. I forwarded the letter to Priya within minutes. She called back in an hour, voice tight. Granite Crest Property Consultants, LLC was registered with the Texas Secretary of State on April 29th, 6 days ago. The registered agent is Gary Marsh. I said nothing for a moment. Gary. Her husband Gary. Yes. I sat down. She created a second company. In her husband's name. Yes. And she's using HOA funds to hire it. That appears to be the case, though we'd need the financial records to confirm the payment. Marcus, this is not subtle. She's doing it again and doing it faster before the TREC review concludes, because she thinks the confusion of multiple entities will buy time. Or, I said slowly, she wants me on record refusing an inspection so she can claim I'm obstructing community governance. Priya paused. That's also possible. Don't refuse, but don't let them into anything you're not legally required to provide access to. I'll get you a letter to hand them at the door. The inspection happened on May 12th. 2 men arrived. Not Gary Marsh, just 2 guys in polo shirts with clipboards, and I met them at the edge of my property with Priya's letter in hand. The letter stated, formally, that the property owner was cooperating with the assessment within the scope of lawful HOA authority, disputed the authority of the engaging entity to access private driveway areas currently subject to regulatory dispute, and required the assessors to identify themselves and their credentials in writing before any inspection proceeded. The men looked at the letter, looked at each other, and called someone on the phone. After 10 minutes on hold, they left. They did not return. 2 days later, I received a fine notice from the HOA, $300 for obstructing a community-authorized property assessment. I contested it through the TREC file. The fine was now the 14th contested item in my regulatory case. Linda was building a record of my non-compliance. I was building a record of her procedural overreach. We were both betting on whose record would matter more. On May 15th, a woman knocked on my door. I didn't recognize her at first. She was in her mid-50s, well-dressed, with the careful composure of someone who'd traveled to have a difficult conversation. She introduced herself as Sandra Okafor. I'm Linda's sister-in-law, she said. Gary's sister. I'm not here on their behalf. May I come in? I let her in. I made coffee. Sandra sat at my kitchen table and said, in a voice very controlled, I want you to know that I don't know exactly what Linda has done in this neighborhood. But I know my sister-in-law and I know how she operates, and I'm going to tell you something because I think you're In the right and because I believe in doing things correctly. Gary's company, Granite Crest. He didn't know Linda was registering it in his name. She did it with his information without telling him. He found out when he got a Secretary of State notice in the mail. I set my coffee mug down very carefully. Gary didn't know?
No.
He's not happy. Sandra looked at her hands. He's also not in a position to go up against his wife publicly. But he's not going to stand in the way of whatever process is happening. And neither am I. I asked why she was telling me. She said, because nobody has told the truth in this situation yet, and I'm tired of being a marsh by marriage. I thanked her. I didn't call Priya right away. I sat for a while with the weight of it. Gary Marsh had been used by his own wife. That was new information, and it was useful in ways I hadn't anticipated. Priya, when I told her, was quiet for a long time. Then, if Gary didn't authorize the use of his identity, Linda may have committed identity fraud in addition to the self-dealing violations. We need to document this carefully and, ideally, have Gary give a statement. His sister thinks he might cooperate. Can you set up a meeting? I said I'd try. Sandra Okafor was my contact point. I texted her that afternoon. She replied within an hour. I'll talk to him. Give me a few days. The days passed slowly. Linda, apparently sensing that something had shifted, escalated the neighborhood pressure campaign. She circulated a petition, hand-delivered, by Diane, to every door in the neighborhood, asking residents to affirm their support for HOA governance and the legal safeguarding of community property values. The petition specifically mentioned the ongoing dispute at 14 Clover Ridge Lane as an example of why organized opposition to lawful HOA authority damages community cohesion. She was trying to get my neighbors to sign a document against me. Some of them did. I didn't blame them. They'd been living in Linda's neighborhood for years. She controlled their property values in ways that felt real even if they were largely illusory. And she was persuasive. But most didn't. And a few who had started to sign came back to Diane and asked to have their names removed after they got my version of events via the group text. Diane, to her credit, accommodated those requests, which told me Diane was not fully aboard whatever Linda was sailing. I talked to Derek about Diane. She goes where it's safe, he said. She's not malicious. She's conflict avoidant. She latched onto Linda when Linda was the most powerful thing in the room. If Linda stops being powerful, he left it unfinished. She reassesses. I said. Yeah, Derek said. Keep that in mind. On May 21st, Sandra Okafor texted me, Gary will meet with you and your attorney. He wants this handled quietly. No press, no public statement at this stage. Just documentation. I called Priya. She cleared her Thursday afternoon. We met Gary Marsh at a Panera near his office, Neutral Ground, his choice. Gary was a quiet man with the look of someone who'd been disappointed by life in ways he hadn't predicted. He brought his own attorney, a small firm guy named Reeves who'd clearly been briefed. Gary's account was detailed and specific. Linda had asked him for his social security number and LLC registration information for a financial planning matter in late April. He'd given it without suspicion. The first he'd heard of Granite Crest Property Consultants was when the Secretary of State notice arrived. He'd confronted Linda. She'd told him it was a technical business structure and that he didn't need to worry about it. He'd asked if HOA money was involved. She'd said not directly. He'd asked again. She'd stopped answering. Gary Marsh, it turned out, had his own file. He'd been quietly gathering financial documents since May, from their shared accounts, from the HOA budget reports Linda kept at home, from the corporate filing notice, because his own attorney had told him that if this became legal trouble, he needed to know what he was exposed to. He had documents I hadn't seen. He had documents his wife didn't know he had. Priya spent 2 hours going through them with Reeves while Gary and I sat in a booth and drank mediocre coffee and said nothing particularly meaningful to each other. At the end, Priya came over and said, quietly, "The Granite Crest payments from the HOA Improvement Fund total $4,200 in invoices already submitted, for assessment services not yet rendered. The money was transferred before the inspections happened, before any services were provided. That's not just self-dealing, that may be wire fraud." Gary stared at his coffee. "I didn't know," he said. I believed him. "I know," I said. We left Panera with a cooperation agreement from Gary. He'd make himself available for a formal interview with the AG's office and provide his documents through his own attorney. He asked only that his name be kept out of press coverage until charges, if any, were filed. Priya agreed. I agreed. Gary shook my hand at the door, didn't say anything, and walked to his car. I watched him go. I thought about the boat, Gary's big fishing boat, still parked on the street. I wondered if Linda had known it would trigger me. I wondered if she'd used her own husband's indulgence as a way to test my limits. That would be very Linda. The TREC investigation was now in its active phase. A case officer named Rodriguez had been assigned and had requested a phone interview with me, which Priya and I did on May 28th. Rodriguez was professional and methodical. He'd clearly reviewed the file thoroughly. He asked about the bylaw amendment, the emergency authority history, the easement reclassification. He also, which surprised me, asked about the property survey patterns, the disparate enforcement data that Brenda and Mrs. Nguyen had compiled. Someone had sent it to him. I asked who. He said the commission received it as a supplemental submission from concerned community members. I made a mental note to thank Brenda. On June 2nd, Linda did something that I can only describe as a Hail Mary. She called a full member meeting, a legitimate one with 14 days' notice posted publicly and emailed to every resident. The agenda had one item: member vote on community governance priorities, including endorsement of current HOA leadership. She was trying to get the whole neighborhood to vote confidence in her. If she could get a majority on record, she might be able to argue to TREC that the community supported her administration's actions. It was a smart play. Not smart enough, but smart. She'd counted on apathy. Most HOA member votes got 20, 25 people at best. If she could pack the room with her allies and get a quorum of supporters on record, it gave her a narrative. The neighbors back me, this is just one disgruntled man. I looked at the notice and called the group text. The meeting is June 16th, I said. We all need to be there. 48 hours after Linda posted her meeting notice, I posted my own. A community information session, the following Saturday, at Brenda Howell's house. Open to all residents. No agenda required, just coffee and conversation about HOA governance. Brenda was happy to host. She made her famous lemon pound cake. 29 people came. It was more than had come to any HOA meeting in recent memory. I didn't run the meeting like a prosecution. I ran it like a neighborhood conversation. I asked people to share their experiences, not their opinions of Linda, their experiences. What fine had they received? What request had been denied? What interaction had left them feeling uncomfortable or uncertain? And they did. For 2 hours, people talked. Some of it was small. Some of it was significant. All of it was true. And when it was done, the room had a shared understanding it hadn't had before. Mrs. Nguyen spoke near the end. She didn't talk about the door fine. She talked about the phone call she'd gotten from Linda after she'd submitted a variance request for a small pergola in her backyard. Linda had called her, not emailed, called, and told her very warmly, very collegially, that she wanted to help the request go through, but that there were certain neighbors who had concerns about certain cultural elements of backyard structures. I didn't understand right away what she was saying, Mrs. Nguyen said quietly. Then I understood. She was telling me that my pergola looked too Asian. She was telling me that if I made it look more American, she would approve it. The room was very, very quiet. After the session, I sat alone in Brenda's backyard for 20 minutes while people filtered out. The lemon pound cake was mostly gone. The Texas evening was warm and soft. I thought about what I was doing. Not the legal strategy, not the documents, but the actual thing. Asking people to trust me, to put their names on things, to stand up in ways that had real costs for their daily lives in this neighborhood. And I thought about whether I was sure enough about what I was doing to ask that of them. I decided I was. I went home and updated my spreadsheet. The week before Linda's June 16th meeting, something happened that I didn't engineer and didn't expect. Camille Torres's article ran in the Austin American-Statesman. It was thorough, fair, and devastating. It described the easement dispute, the TREC investigation, and the financial irregularities in careful, attributed terms. It quoted Carol Sims on the record. "The board has not always operated transparently, and I believe the members of this community deserve better." Quoted Brenda Howell. It quoted Mrs. Nguyen briefly about her call from Linda. Linda's attorney provided a statement calling the article factually incomplete and materially misleading, which is what attorneys say when they can't say, "None of this is true." The article was shared in the Millfield Estates Facebook group 847 times. I know because I watched the number go up. It was also picked up by 2 local TV stations, both of which did brief segments. Neither segment was deeply reported, but both used the word investigation, and both showed the neighborhood entrance sign, which featured, and I will not pretend I didn't appreciate this, the name Millfield Estates in large, visible letters next to Linda's photo from the HOA website. Linda's response to the article was to send a neighborhood-wide email at 11 p.m. on the night it ran. The email was long, professional, and contained the phrase politically motivated attack 4 times. It also, in a move that I can only attribute to a loss of editorial judgment brought on by stress, included the line, "I have dedicated years of my life to this community and will not stand by while disgruntled individuals with personal axes to grind destroy what we have built." The phrase axes to grind at 11 p.m. did not play well. By the next morning, it had been screenshotted and shared widely. Brenda Howell put it in the shared folder labeled, by community vote, the documents. The June 16th meeting arrived. Linda had reserved the clubhouse and set up rows of chairs. I don't know what turnout she'd expected. She got 63 people, more than the Millfield Estates HOA had ever had at a member meeting, by Priya's research into past minutes. Linda stood at the front with her PowerPoint and her lawyer in the back of the room and her confidence, which was slightly less polished than usual but still technically present. She went through her slides. Property values up. Improvements made. Community safety enhanced. The TREC investigation characterized as a regulatory review process that we are cooperating with fully and expect to conclude without findings of any wrongdoing. She presented a resolution. The membership of Millfield Estates HOA affirms its confidence in the current board leadership and authorizes the board to proceed with governance operations as planned. She called for a vote. Hands went up for. Then Linda asked for hands against. More hands went up. Then she asked for abstentions. About a quarter of the room. She looked at the count. She asked Diane to recount. Diane counted. Diane leaned over and whispered something to Linda. Linda's face went, for just a moment, very still. The resolution failed. Not dramatically, it wasn't a rout. But it failed, and it failed in a room Linda had called, in front of 63 neighbors, with a lawyer present, 3 days after a newspaper article had run about her HOA's financial irregularities. That failure was on the record. The meeting had minutes. Diane was required to produce them, and for the first time, Linda Marsh had put her authority to a vote and lost. She gavelled the meeting closed faster than I'd seen any HOA meeting close. She didn't stay for the social portion. Her lawyer was in his car before most people had stood up from their chairs. I stood near the door and watched neighbors I'd never spoken to come over to shake my hand or clap me on the shoulder or just nod. The way people nod when they've witnessed something and you all know what it meant. Brenda Howell hugged me. Mrs. Nguyen shook my hand with both of hers. Carol Sims, from across the room, gave me a look I couldn't fully read. Something between relief and grief. The look of someone who'd spent a long time waiting for permission to do the right thing. 2 days later, Derek Park submitted his formal resignation from the HOA board. His resignation letter, which he shared with the neighborhood group before sending, was 3 pages long and detailed every irregular board action he'd witnessed since joining. It named names. It cited specific meetings and specific votes. It was addressed to the board, to TREC, and to the county DA's office simultaneously. "I should have done this 6 months ago," he told me when he texted me a copy. "Better now than never," I said. He said, "Yeah." He sounded tired in a good way, like someone who'd put down something heavy. Linda's lawyer sent a letter the following day demanding Derek retract his resignation letter as defamatory. Derek's own attorney, he'd hired one after our Panera meeting, responded by noting that factual statements made to regulatory authorities enjoy legal privilege and asking the HOA's attorney to identify any specific factual inaccuracy in the letter. No response came. The demand letter was added to the documents. I want to be honest. Those 2 weeks after the failed confidence vote were heady. The article, the meeting result, Derek's letter, it felt in the way that things sometimes do before the bottom falls out, like we were winning. I reminded myself of what my mom had said. Cornered people don't lose gracefully. I kept my files current. I kept talking to Priya. I did not celebrate. Not yet. Because on June 25th, Linda made the move I'd been dreading. She came to my house at 7:30 in the morning. Not to knock, not to talk. I watched from my bedroom window as she walked slowly up my driveway, paused at the widened strip, looked at it for a long moment, and then took a photograph with her phone. She didn't look at my house. She walked back to the street, got in her car, and drove away. I stood in my bedroom for 5 minutes trying to figure out what that meant. Then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "She filed a complaint with the county assessor's office last week. I just found out. Property line dispute tied to the easement. It would freeze your ability to refinance or sell." R. I didn't know who R was, but I knew what it meant. The county assessor complaint was a nuclear option, not because it would likely succeed, but because a property line dispute on file with the assessor would create a title cloud on my house. A title cloud means that if I ever tried to refinance my mortgage or sell the property, the dispute would have to be resolved first. It was a weapon designed not to win an argument but to lock me in place, to make my house into a trap. And Linda had filed it quietly, a week ago, and I was only now finding out. I called Priya. I could hear in her voice that she'd been expecting something like this. Not this specifically, but something. "We can challenge it," she said. "The complaint would need to go through the assessor's review process, and with our survey documentation it should be defeatable. But it takes time, potentially months." "She knows that," I said. "Yes, she does. Marcus, this is the move of someone who thinks they're losing the war and is trying to make the peace as costly as possible. She's not trying to win anymore. She's trying to make it not worth winning." I sat with that. Outside, the early June light was coming golden over my driveway, over the strip of pavement that had started all of this, over the spot where my mom parked. "It's worth winning," I said. That afternoon, I got another text from the unknown number, R. It said, "There's more. The law firm she hired initially. She's not paying them anymore. She's running the legal strategy herself now. Gary isn't supporting her financially or legally. Their accounts are separated. She's alone in this. I texted back, "Who is this?" The reply, "Someone who should have spoken up sooner." I stared at that for a long time. Then I put my phone down and pulled up my spreadsheet. I added a new column, ally status, confirmed. I had Carol, Derek, Gary, through Reeves, Sandra, Brenda, then Gwyn's, a dozen others. I had TREC, the AG referral, and now, apparently, at least one more person inside Linda's circle who was watching the walls close and choosing a side. I thought about what it means when people who've been complicit start looking for exits. It usually means they can see the end. The end that I could see, that I'd been building toward for months, required one more piece. I needed Linda herself on record. Not through her attorney's statements, not through her HOA emails, but her actual voice saying the things she believed she was safe to say. I thought carefully about how that might happen. I thought about what I knew of Linda, her confidence in rooms she controlled, her tendency to explain herself when she believed she was untouchable, her pride in her own governance work. I had an idea. I called Brenda. "I want to request a formal HOA mediation session," I told her. Under the dispute resolution provisions in the bylaws, Linda is required to attend and participate in a mediation if a member requests one. She can't duck it without formally refusing, and refusing is a bylaw violation. Brenda said, "What do you want to get out of it?" I said, "A recording, conversation." Linda, in a controlled setting, explaining herself, without her lawyer coaching every syllable, without her curated presentation, without the audience she performs for. Just her and me and a mediator and a recording device, which is legal with proper notice in Texas. Brenda was quiet. "You think she'll incriminate herself?" "I think she'll be Linda," I said. "I think that's enough." The mediation request was filed on June 28th. Linda's attorney responded almost immediately. Their client was committed to cooperative resolution and would attend a mediation session under HOA Bylaw 19.3. The session was scheduled for July 14th at a neutral location, a conference room at a downtown Austin mediation center. I told Priya. Priya said, "I'll be there." I said, "That's the point." In the 2 weeks before the mediation, Linda apparently concluded that I had something she didn't know about. This is the only explanation I have for what happened next. On July 3rd, she broke into Derek Park's abandoned HOA board account. Derek had resigned but hadn't had his access credentials revoked. An administrative oversight. Linda used his login to access the HOA document server and attempted to delete or overwrite 17 documents. She did not succeed, because Derek had already removed the original files and replaced them with read-only copies. But the server logged her IP address, her login credentials, Derek's credentials, used from her home network, and every action she took. Derek's IT firm confirmed all of it. When Derek showed me the server log, I stared at it for a long moment. Then I said, "She knows. That I have the documents? That she's losing. This is what my mom warned me about." I sent the server log to Priya. Priya sent it to the DA's office the same day, flagging it as potential evidence of unauthorized computer access. A state felony in Texas under the Computer Crimes Act. The mediation was still 12 days away. The ground was moving fast. I spent the 4th of July on my porch, watching the neighborhood set off sparklers in the cul-de-sac. The Nguyen's came over and brought banh mi. Brenda brought lemonade. Mr. Peterson sat in one of my lawn chairs and fell asleep before the fireworks started, which I found deeply comforting. Derek came by and we drank a beer and didn't talk about any of it. Mrs. Nguyen's kids chased lightning bugs until dark. It was a good evening. I thought about the person I'd been 7 years ago, buying this house alone, a little terrified, proud of the driveway I'd eventually widen for my mother. I thought about how none of this, not the legal strategy, not the documents, not the coalition of neighbors in my group text, would have happened if I just moved the cone and gone inside and told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I was glad I hadn't done that. Even on the hard days, I was glad. Linda, that same evening, posted a photo to her personal Facebook page. A picture of Millfield Estates at dusk, the neighborhood entrance sign lit up, the landscaping manicured and beautiful. The caption read, "Still standing, still protecting what matters. Community HOA neighborhood." It got 14 likes. One of them was Diane. One of them, I noticed, was from an account called Real Estate Advocacy TX, an account I'd never heard of. I made a note. Real Estate Advocacy TX turned out, on closer inspection, to be a very new social media account, created 3 weeks prior, that had been sharing HOA advocacy content and, specifically, several posts defending targeted homeowner associations facing regulatory overreach. It had 43 followers. It had posted 11 times, all in June and July. Several of the posts quoted language that appeared in Linda's HOA newsletters. Not exactly, but close enough to suggest common authorship. I screenshotted everything and added it to the documents. On July 10th, 4 days before the mediation, I received a certified letter from Linda's attorney. Not a fine notice, not a bylaw citation, a personal civil lawsuit. Linda Marsh, in her personal capacity, was suing me for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with HOA governance. The suit sought $150,000 in damages. The letter was accompanied by a press release, an actual press release, dated the same day, announcing the lawsuit and describing me as having engaged in a coordinated campaign of harassment and misinformation against a dedicated community volunteer. I sat at my kitchen table with the lawsuit and the press release side by side and took several slow breaths. Then I called Priya. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been expecting it. "She filed," I said. "She filed," Priya confirmed. "This is a slap suit, Marcus. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. She's not trying to win it. She's trying to silence you, drain your resources, and generate a news cycle where she's the victim. Is it going to work? Not if we file a slap motion immediately, which we will. Texas has an anti-slap statute, the TCPA. If we win the motion, she pays your legal fees. But it takes 90 days to adjudicate and it's messy. She knows that too." I read the press release again. It described me as a disgruntled neighbor who purchased an illegally expanded driveway and, when confronted with proper enforcement, launched a campaign of harassment against an elected community volunteer. It included a quote from Linda, "I have served this community faithfully for years, and I will not allow personal vendettas to destroy what our neighbors have built together." The press release had been sent to the Austin American-Statesman, 2 local TV stations, and 3 real estate trade publications. Camille Torres called me within the hour. "Want to respond?" I said, "Yes, but not today. Give me 48 hours. She agreed. I spent those 48 hours not panicking, which took some effort, and instead compiling the most complete, timeline-organized summary of the case that I had produced yet. I sent it to Priya, to Carol, to Derek, to Gary's attorney Reeves, and to a new contact Priya had connected me with, a civil rights attorney named Dr. Angela Frost, who specialized in housing discrimination and was interested in the disparate enforcement data. Dr. Frost read the summary and called me the same evening. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I'd like to join your team. Pro bono." I asked why. She said, "Because I've been waiting for a case with this much documentation for years." The day before the scheduled mediation, Linda's attorney called Priya to request a postponement. He cited new information requiring additional legal preparation. Priya said no, the mediation was properly noticed, the mediator was engaged, and our client had cleared his schedule. The attorney said he'd need to advise his client. Priya said, "Please do." 15 minutes later, he called back and confirmed they'd attend. I got to the mediation center at 8:30 a.m., half an hour early. Priya was already there, as was Dr. Frost, who had joined us officially the previous week. The conference room was neutral and beige and had the antiseptic calm of a space designed for difficult conversations. I wore a blue shirt and slacks, nothing too formal, nothing that said I was performing for anyone. I wanted to look like what I was, a person who had simply decided not to be pushed around. Linda arrived at 9 on the dot with her attorney and, unexpectedly, Diane. I watched Diane's face when she saw the three people on my side of the table, Priya, Dr. Frost, and me. Something moved across Diane's expression that I couldn't immediately name. Not fear exactly. More like the look of someone who has walked into a room and realized, too late, that they've been miscounting. The mediator introduced himself, a retired judge, calm and gray-haired, and explained the process. Linda's attorney immediately objected to the presence of Dr. Frost, arguing that she hadn't been disclosed as counsel in the HOA dispute. Dr. Frost explained pleasantly that she was present in relation to a separate matter, the Fair Housing Act inquiry, and that her presence was relevant to any comprehensive resolution. The mediator allowed it over the attorney's objection. Linda looked at Dr. Frost for a long moment, then looked at me, and I could see her recalculating. The first 2 hours were procedural, a lot of attorney talk about the TREC filing, the easement dispute, the civil lawsuit. Linda's attorney did most of the speaking on her side. Linda sat very upright, very composed, occasionally writing notes. She was in full president mode. Blazer, reading glasses, the practiced calm of someone who has run a lot of meetings. I let Priya handle our side. I watched Linda. The break point came around 11:30, when the mediator asked for a short recess and then suggested that the parties have a direct conversation. Principals only, no attorneys, with the mediator present. Linda's attorney started to object. Linda stopped him with a small gesture. "Fine," she said. She looked at me. "Fine." I looked at Priya. Priya nodded slightly. This was what we'd been working toward. When the room was down to Linda, me, and the mediator, Linda folded her hands on the table and looked at me with the direct, measured gaze she used when she was about to be very honest in a very strategic way. "Marcus," she said, "let's talk about what we both actually want." I said, "Okay. You want your driveway. You want the fines rescinded. You want the easement designation reversed. Among other things," I said. She tilted her head. "And I want to conclude my term as president without my work being characterized as criminal when it isn't." I kept my voice neutral. "What would you characterize it as?" She paused. "Aggressive governance. Strong advocacy for property values. Some decisions that in retrospect could have been handled more transparently." I said, "Linda, you hired your own company with HOA money." She looked at me steadily. "LM Property Solutions provided legitimate services. The board should have been formally notified. That's a process error. And Granite Crest? In your husband's name, without his knowledge." Her composure flickered just for a fraction of a second. "Granite Crest was also a legitimate. Gary Marsh has given a statement to investigators," I said. "He didn't know. He said so in writing." Linda went still. The mediator watched us both. She recovered quickly. She was good. She really was. But the recovery took a beat longer than usual. "Gary is going through a difficult time," she said carefully. "His account of events may not fully reflect his understanding of the arrangements. His attorney has reviewed the Secretary of State filing and the HOA payment records," I said. "His understanding is quite clear." Another pause. "What do you want, Marcus?" she said again. But the voice was different now. Not the opening line of a negotiation. Something more tired. Something more real. I told her exactly what I wanted. Full rescission of the easement reclassification, documented formally and filed with the county. Dismissal of the civil lawsuit with prejudice. Formal financial restitution to the HOA Improvement Fund for all Elm. Property solutions and Granite Crest payments. Her resignation as HOA president within 30 days. And a formal apology in writing addressed to the HOA membership, acknowledging that her administration had acted inequitably in enforcement. I said it steadily and without drama. The mediator wrote it down. Linda stared at me for a long time. You want my resignation? Yes. After 3 years of work building this neighborhood. Yes. That's not a resolution. That's a humiliation. I looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in this whole thing, not as an adversary to outmaneuver but as a person. She was 61 years old. She'd poured herself into a HOA in a suburb of Austin, and she'd made it into something she could control and something that feared her and something that validated her in a way that the rest of her life apparently didn't. And now it was collapsing and she knew it. Linda, I said, I'm not doing this to humiliate you. I'm doing it because a woman cried on her own front step over a door she painted with her own hands, and you made her feel like her house wasn't hers. I'm doing it because you tried to take a strip of my driveway where my mother parks because she has a bad hip and parking on the street hurts her. I'm doing it because the people in this neighborhood deserve better than what they've been living under. That's not a humiliation. That's an accounting. The mediator said nothing. Linda said nothing. The room was very quiet. After 20 minutes of silence broken only by Linda writing something on her notepad, she asked to bring her attorney back in. We reconvened with all parties. Her attorney said they needed time to review the terms. The mediator gave them until July 21st, 1 week. We left the mediation center at 1:15 p.m. In the parking garage, Priya squeezed my arm and said, "You did well," Dr. Frost said. "She knows she's cooked. The question is how she falls." The week between mediation and the response deadline was outwardly quiet. Linda posted nothing on social media. The HOA sent no newsletters. There was no activity on the case docket. But on July 17th, 4 days before the deadline, something happened that I had not engineered. A resident of Birchwood Court, Tom Albright's neighbor, a retired couple named the Holloways, contacted Brenda Howell and asked to speak with me. They had a story. They had documents. They had, they said, been afraid to come forward because Tom Albright had told them, explicitly, that going against Linda would result in a property assessment that would dramatically affect their home's valuation. They had it in a text. Tom had texted it to them. It was obstruction. It was extortion. It was exactly the kind of thing you don't text to people. Priya sent the Holloway materials to the DA's office the same day. By July 19th, the DA's office had opened a formal criminal inquiry. Not just the AG's civil referral, but a criminal inquiry into the HOA's conduct. The detective assigned to the case called me the next morning to introduce herself. Her name was Detective Maria Chin. She was very professional and very brief. She was investigating potential criminal fraud, unauthorized computer access, and possible extortion. She asked me not to discuss the criminal aspects publicly. I said, of course. I hung up. I looked at my spreadsheet. I thought, we are now in a different category of this thing. I was not entirely prepared for that, even though I had helped build it. On July 21st, the mediation response deadline, Linda's attorney called Priya at 4:58 p.m. and said his client was declining to accept the mediation terms. He did not explain why. He said they were prepared to litigate. Priya hung up and called me. She said no. I thought about Detective Chun. I thought about the Holloway's text. I thought about Gary's statement. Okay, I said. Then we let it run. Marcus, there's going to be more coming. Probably soon. I know. I paused. Priya, are we ready? Yes, she said. Are you? Yes, I said. I meant it. July 23rd. 2 days after the mediation deadline. I was at my desk at work when my phone rang. A number I didn't know. I answered. A woman's voice, quiet and rushed. Mr. Webb, my name is Christine. I work for the law firm that represents the HOA. I am not calling in any official capacity. I am calling because I've been watching what's been filed with this case and I need you to know something. Linda Marsh has asked our firm to alter a document. A board meeting minute from March. She wants the record to show that the Granite Crest authorization was disclosed to all board members when it wasn't. Our firm told her no. She asked again. We told her no again. She fired us this morning. I said nothing for a moment. Are you going to report this? Christine said, our firm is discussing that now. But I wanted you to know. Because if it's not in the record from your side, it should be. She hung up. I stared at my phone for 30 seconds. Then I called Priya. The law firm, to their credit, reported Linda's request to alter records to the State Bar of Texas the following day. The State Bar opened an inquiry. It did not directly touch Linda legally, but it created a documented record of attempted evidence tampering in the hands of the bar, linked to the ongoing criminal investigation. The wall was getting smaller and the exits were narrowing. Linda had one more play. I should have predicted it. On July 26th, she submitted an emergency resignation from the HOA board, not in response to my mediation terms, but as a preemptive action. She announced it in a neighborhood-wide email, framed as a personal decision. She was stepping down to focus on family matters and allow the community to heal from recent tensions. She thanked her supporters. She did not apologize. She did not mention the TREC investigation, the criminal inquiry, the civil lawsuit, or any of the specific complaints. She wrote as if she were simply choosing to leave, freely on her own terms, because she was a gracious leader who knew when to step back. The email landed in my inbox at 8:12 a.m. on a Saturday. I read it 3 times. I called Brenda. I called Carol. I called Derek. They'd all gotten it. There was a range of reactions. Carol felt cautious relief. Derek was furious at the framing. Brenda sent me a voice memo of her laughing for 45 seconds and then saying, "She thinks she can just leave like that?" And I thought, yes, she thinks she can. The question is whether she can. The answer, shaped by Detective Chun and Priya and Dr. Frost and a case that had long since outgrown my driveway, was not quite. August in Austin is the kind of heat that makes everything feel slightly unreal. You walk outside and the air hits you like an open oven and your brain slows down just enough that you start thinking in long, horizontal thoughts. I spent that August doing the exact opposite of relaxing. I was deposing people. I was producing documents. I was on the phone with Priya and Dr. Frost and Detective Chun and the TREC case officer Rodriguez and Gary Marsh's attorney Reeves. Often multiple times a day. Linda's resignation had not stopped anything. TREC doesn't close an investigation because the subject resigns. The DA's office doesn't drop a criminal inquiry because someone steps down. The civil lawsuit she'd filed against me was still active. She was still technically the plaintiff, suing me for defamation and tortious interference, even as the very governance she claimed I'd interfered with was under criminal scrutiny. The irony was structural and vast. Priya filed the anti-SLAPP motion, the TCPA motion, on August 3rd. The motion argued that my actions, speaking to neighbors, compiling documents, filing regulatory complaints, talking to the press, were all protected exercises of the right of free speech and petition on a matter of public concern, and that the lawsuit was therefore subject to dismissal under the Texas Citizens Participation Act. If the motion succeeded, The lawsuit would be dismissed and Linda would owe my attorney's fees. The motion was heard on September 10th. In the meantime, Trek's formal findings were released to the parties on August 14th. They were 32 pages long. The findings confirmed. The March bylaw amendment was procedurally invalid due to the manufactured emergency authority invocation, meaning the original 2/3 member vote requirement remained in effect. The easement reclassification, which had relied on the invalid amendment, was therefore without legal authority and was reversed effective immediately. LM Property Solutions had received $8,400 in HOA funds without disclosure of the president's ownership interest, constituting a self-dealing violation under Texas law. Granite Crest had received $4,200 in HOA funds for services that were never rendered, and enforcement patterns showed statistically significant disparities that warranted referral to the Texas Workforce Commission's Civil Rights Division for further review. 32 pages. 7 years of slow accumulation, Linda's and mine. I printed the whole thing out and read it at my kitchen table with coffee going cold beside me. I got to the section on the easement reversal and I had to stop and put the report down for a minute. Because it said, in the careful formal language of state regulatory bodies, that my driveway was mine, that the strip where my mother parked had never stopped being mine, that Linda Marsh had no legal authority to put that cone there, that everything she tried to do had been outside the scope of what she was allowed to do, built on a foundation that wasn't real. I called my mom. She answered on the second ring the way she always does. I said, "Mom, it's done. The state found in our favor." A pause. Then, all of it. The driveway, the fines, the bylaws. All of it, Mom. She made a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite laughing. Then she said, "When can I come visit?" "Whenever you want," I said. "Your spot's there." She came the following weekend. The neighborhood received a summary of the TREC findings via a formal notice required under state HOA law. I don't know what Linda's reaction was. We had no contact at that point, but Diane called Carol Sims the morning the notice went out. Carol told me about it later. Diane had cried. Not strategically, not for an audience. Diane had read the findings and called Carol and cried, and said she'd been wrong, and that she was sorry she hadn't done more to stop it. Carol had been kind about it, in the way of someone who understood the cost of being afraid. Tom Albright issued a one-sentence public statement through his attorney. He was cooperating fully with all regulatory processes. The Holloway extortion allegation had apparently focused his mind considerably. His statement did not include an apology, but it did not include defiance either. It was the statement of a man who'd looked at what he'd done and decided discretion was his best remaining option. Dr. Frost's civil rights referral to the federal level was now formally opened as an inquiry by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It was early stage, no findings, no formal charges, but the inquiry existed, and HUD had sent a formal inquiry letter to the HOA requesting enforcement records for the past 5 years. The disparate enforcement patterns that Brenda and Mrs. Nguyen had documented in a Google spreadsheet were now in the hands of federal investigators. That was a sentence I had not imagined saying when I started keeping notes. The Nguyen's repainted their front door. They chose the same olive green. Mrs. Nguyen sent me a photo of it, her daughter standing in front of the door, grinning with both thumbs up. I put the photo in a frame. It's on my bookshelf now, next to a copy of the TREC findings. Through August, I watched the neighborhood change in small but definite ways. People started talking more on the street, at the mailboxes, in the way neighbors actually talk when they're not afraid of being reported to someone. The Pedersens invited the Nguyen's to dinner. Brenda organized a block cookout on Maple Terrace and 40 people came. The common areas were maintained. The HOA's operating board, now down to Carol and 2 newly elected members, Brenda herself, and a retired pharmacist named Henry Lamb, kept things running. The landscaping contract stayed. The pool stayed heated. The world did not end because Linda Marsh was gone. I had a harder time than I expected feeling settled. Not sad, not at all. But the thing I'd been working toward for months had arrived, and there's a particular form of disorientation that comes when a fight you've been in for a long time is suddenly structurally over. I kept checking my spreadsheet. I kept waiting for the next thing. My therapist, whom I'd started seeing in March because the stress had gotten real, said this was normal. You built an identity around the problem, she said. Now you get to build an identity around the resolution. I told her I wasn't sure I knew how to do that. She said, "That's what we're here for." Detective Chun called on August 27th. She said the criminal investigation had produced sufficient findings for the DA's office to move forward. She said she couldn't give me details, but that I should be aware that formal action may come within the next 30 days, and that I might be contacted as a witness. I thanked her. I sat for a moment after we hung up. Then I sent Priya a one-word text, 30. She replied, "I know. I heard too. Stay steady." I stayed steady. I went to work. I had my therapist. I had my mom's visit, which was exactly what I needed. She spent the weekend helping me replant the herb garden on my back patio, which had gotten leggy and unpruned while I was fighting an HOA. We planted rosemary and basil and something she called comfort mint, which may or may not be a real horticultural category. We drank sweet tea. We didn't talk about Linda Marsh once. Carol Sims, now effectively acting HOA president pending a formal election, called a member meeting for September 5th. It was the first HOA meeting I'd attended where the atmosphere felt different. Not performative, not fearful, not carefully managed. People asked real questions and got real answers. Carol presented the TREC findings plainly. She presented the interim financial audit that the new board had commissioned. She answered everything she knew and said, "I don't know yet," to the things she didn't. It was the most honest HOA meeting I'd ever attended. Took 40 minutes. People went home feeling okay. At the September 5th meeting, Henry Lamb moved to approve the creation of a permanent conflict of interest policy requiring board members to disclose financial interests in any entities receiving HOA funds. Brenda seconded. Passed unanimously. Then Brenda moved to formalize the HOA's enforcement policy with explicit written criteria for fine issuance, mandatory documentation of all exemptions, and equal application across the neighborhood. Henry seconded. Passed unanimously. Then Carol moved to formally rename the HOA Improvement Fund to the Community Improvement Fund, with a publicly posted budget and quarterly expense reports. Passed unanimously. 3 votes. 42 minutes total. 7 years of harm addressed in 3 votes on a warm September evening in Austin, Texas. I walked home from that meeting in the dark, past the houses I'd been living beside for 7 years, past the lawns and the porch lights and the mailboxes at the right shade of beige or the wrong shade of beige or whatever shade they actually were in the dark when no one was watching. I felt something that I recognized, after a moment, as ordinary. Just a person walking home through their neighborhood after a meeting. Just ordinary. I'd missed ordinary. September 10th. The anti-SLAPP hearing. The judge was a no-nonsense district court judge who'd clearly read the entire motion and record before we got there. Linda's attorney argued that the suit involved legitimate legal claims of defamation and tortious interference. Priya's argument was tight, documented, and lasted exactly as long as the law required. The judge asked 3 sharp questions of Linda's attorney. 2 of them he couldn't fully answer. The third he answered incorrectly, which Priya flagged immediately with a case citation. The judge thanked both parties. She said she'd issue a ruling within 15 days. I went back to work. I updated my spreadsheet. I watered the herb garden. I had dinner with Derek, who was planning his road trip and seemed lighter than I'd ever seen him. The particular lightness of someone who's done an honest thing and survived it. We talked about places to hike in New Mexico. We talked about whether the new Fast and Furious movie was as bad as it looked. He said yes, worse actually, he'd seen it with his girlfriend. I said I'd take his word for it. It was a good dinner. On September 14th, the county assessor's office closed Linda's property line complaint against me. The complaint had been reviewed against my license survey and determined to be without sufficient factual basis to initiate a formal dispute process. The title cloud on my house was lifted. I called my mortgage broker, somewhat at random, just to hear her say that everything on my property record looked clean. She said it. I said thank you. I sat for a moment in the very specific relief of knowing that my house was simply, cleanly mine again. September 19th. I was in the middle of a work call when Priya texted, "Ruling came in. Check your email." I muted myself on the call and opened my email. The subject line was from the district court clerk. I opened it. The judge had granted the anti-SLAPP motion. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. Linda Marsh was ordered to pay my attorney's fees, $31,400, which represented Priya's hours on the case since the suit was filed. The order was 4 pages, and the language was not gentle. The court found that the suit was clearly filed in response to protected activities, and that the plaintiff has failed to establish a prima facie case for any of the claims asserted. I read it twice. Then I unmuted myself on my work call and said, "Sorry, I need to step off. Something just came up." I hung up. I called Priya. She answered laughing. $31,400, she said, plus my paralegal's time, which I'm adding. She has to pay that? She has to pay that. Or challenge it, which she won't, because challenging it would require her to argue the motion again, and the record is worse for her now than it was in September. I sat back in my chair. Outside my window, the September light was slanting golden into the afternoon. "Priya," I said, "I want to take you to dinner." She said, "I want you to take me to dinner, but wait 2 weeks." "Why?" "Because in 2 weeks," she said, "there's going to be something else to celebrate." She was right. On September 24th, the Travis County District Attorney's Office filed criminal charges against Linda Marsh. 3 counts: fraudulent misappropriation of nonprofit funds, the LM Property Solutions and Granite Crest payments, unauthorized computer access, the Derrick Park server incident, and 1 count of witness tampering related to the attempted document alteration she'd requested of her law firm. The charges were public. They were in the record. They were real. Linda Marsh was formally, criminally charged with 3 felonies in the state of Texas. I found out the way most of the neighborhood found out. From Camille Torres, who called me at 7 a.m. with the news. I thanked her. I sat in my kitchen with my coffee. I thought about the morning Linda had put that cone in my driveway. I thought about the sign, "Community Easement Area," and private vehicle storage. I thought about the absurdity of what it had taken to respond to that cone. The 7 months of filings and meetings and documents and quiet and fear and solidarity and work. And I thought, okay, we got there. The charges landed on the neighborhood like a stone in a pond. The ripples were various. Some people who'd supported Linda in the early months reached out to me, awkwardly, carefully, with something that wasn't quite an apology but was closer to acknowledgement. One of them, a man named Rich who'd signed the petition against me, sent me a text that said, "I didn't know what I was signing. I'm sorry." I texted back, "I know. Thank you." And I meant it. Diane submitted her own resignation from her HOA secretary role on September 26th. Her letter was brief and contained no dramatics. She cited health reasons. Carol accepted it graciously. Diane moved to a condo in Westlake 6 weeks later. I do not know if she felt remorse. I know that she left. Tom Albright was not charged criminally. The DA's office determined that the Holloway extortion allegation, while documented and disturbing, didn't meet the threshold for criminal extortion under Texas law. He resigned from the board voluntarily the week the charges against Linda were filed. His resignation letter was one sentence: "I am resigning effective immediately." He kept his house. He still lives on Birchwood Court. I see his car in the driveway sometimes. We do not wave. Gary Marsh was not charged with anything. His cooperation with the investigation had been genuine and early, and his role as an unwitting vehicle for Linda's fraud was well documented. He stayed in the house on Clover Ridge Lane. I don't know the state of his marriage. That's his private life and not my business. I hope he's okay. Sandra Okafor stopped by my house a few weeks after the charges. She knocked on the door and handed me a bottle of bourbon, good bourbon, and said, "Thank you for not making Gary a casualty of this." I said, "He wasn't the one who did it." She nodded and left. The bourbon was excellent. The civil rights inquiry, Dr. Frost's thread moved slowly, as federal things do. As of late fall, HUD had not issued formal findings, but the inquiry remained open and the HOA's new board was cooperating fully with document requests. Dr. Frost told me she expected the process to take another year, maybe 2. "These things take time," she said, "but they matter. The record exists now. That's the first thing." I told her I understood. I did understand. Some things you do for the record because the record outlasts you and outlasts the immediate dispute and becomes part of how the next person navigates the same territory. On October 1st, I widened my driveway. Not structurally, I didn't change the footprint. I repaved it, repainted the line markers, and put in a small landscaped border on the left side that made it clear, visually and physically, where my property began and where it stayed. It cost me $1,200 and a Saturday. It was the best $1,200 I spent all year. Linda Marsh's arraignment was set for October 8th at the Travis County Criminal Courthouse. I did not plan to go. I told myself it wasn't my place to sit in a gallery watching someone be formally charged. I'd done the work that led here, and I didn't need to witness the moment itself. Then Priya called me the morning of and said, "You should be there, not to gloat, just to be a witness. You were the first domino. You should see where it landed." I put on clean clothes and drove downtown. The courthouse was ordinary. Marble floors, fluorescent lighting, the particular ambient sound of institutions that have seen everything. Linda's case was one of 11 arraignments on the morning docket. I sat in the gallery. There were a few reporters. Camille Torres was there in the second row, and a handful of other observers I didn't recognize. The HOA's new board had sent no one, which I appreciated. This was not a neighborhood event. This was the justice system doing what it does. Linda came in with her new attorney, not the HOA's old firm, a new one, a criminal defense specialist whose name I'd looked up and who was genuinely well regarded. She was dressed simply, dark blazer, no pearls. Her posture was still very straight. She entered a plea of not guilty. The judge set a trial date and bail conditions. The whole thing took 9 minutes. I watched her walk back through the courtroom door and I thought, she still looks like herself. She still looks like the woman who stood on her porch watching me blink at my own driveway. Whatever this is doing to her on the inside, she is not going to show it in public. I respected that in a cold kind of way. I went home. Camille Torres ran a story the next day with the headline, "HOA President Arraigned on 3 felony counts in Millfield Estates Fraud Case." It was factual and thorough. It mentioned my name once, as the resident whose complaint had initiated the TREC investigation. It spent most of its space on the charges, the HOA's new governance structure, and the broader pattern of HOA power abuse that the case had illuminated. It was not a victory lap article. It was accountability journalism, which is exactly what I'd hoped for when I first called Camille. She did good work. I sent her a note saying so. She replied, "You did good work. I just wrote it down." In the weeks after the arraignment, I started getting contacted by people I'd never met, from other HOA communities in Austin, in San Antonio, in Houston, in the Dallas suburbs. They'd read about the case. They had their own stories. A woman in Plano whose HOA had fined her $500 for a non-compliant wheelchair ramp her elderly mother needed. A family in San Antonio whose president had used HOA funds to pave his own driveway apron and called it shared driveway maintenance. A couple in Sugar Land who'd been subjected to monthly fine letters for 3 years without ever receiving a clear explanation of the alleged violation. They were all, in their different ways, variations on the same story. Someone with institutional authority using it to bully people who couldn't easily fight back. I didn't have the capacity to take on everyone's case. I said so clearly in the emails I wrote back. But I wrote Dr. Frost about it. And she said, "That's why we fight the cases we can document. Because they become the precedent. They become the map." I thought about that a lot. The map. This thing I'd done, this months-long, grinding, exhausting, document-heavy thing, was now part of the map for the next person who got a cone in their driveway. Linda's criminal case moved through pretrial motions over the fall. I was deposed as a witness in October. 4 hours, very thorough, Priya present throughout. I answered every question factually and completely. Her defense attorney was skilled. He tried to frame my role as a targeted campaign of harassment, which was the mirror of Linda's original framing of herself as victim. Priya had prepared me for it. I answered calmly with documentation for every claim. I did not get angry. I did not perform righteousness. I just answered the questions. During my deposition, Linda's attorney asked me, "Mr. Webb, would you say you have a personal vendetta against Ms. Marsh?" I said, "No." He said, "Then how would you characterize your motivation?" I said, "A woman named Julie Gwynn cried on her front porch over a door she painted in her own house. I live across the street. I saw it. I didn't want to live across the street from that and do nothing." He moved on. Priya told me later that Linda's attorney had visibly paused after that answer and written something on his notepad. I don't know what, but he didn't come back to the personal vendetta question. November arrived. The Texas weather finally broke. The heat released its grip and the evenings turned to that particular Austin fall quality. Warm enough for porch sitting, cool enough for a light jacket, the kind of weather that makes you remember why people move to Texas and forgive it everything. I sat on my porch a lot that November, sometimes with neighbors, sometimes alone. I watched Clover Ridge Lane being ordinary and I thought about what it had cost to get here. The costs were real. I'd spent, between Priya's partial fees before the anti-SLAPP award, the surveyor, my own time and the lost opportunity cost of it, somewhere north of $15,000 out of pocket. I'd spent months of emotional energy that I could have directed elsewhere. I'd spent countless hours in a state of low-grade anxiety that I don't think fully lifted until October. Those were real costs. I don't pretend they weren't. But I also thought about what it had given me. Not the win. The win was real, but the win isn't the thing I mean. I mean the group text, Brenda's cookout, Mr. Peterson's manila folder, Mrs. Nguyen's thumbs-up photo, the September HOA meeting where people asked real questions and got real answers. The 3 votes that took 42 minutes. The way the neighborhood felt different now. Not perfect, not some ideal of community, but different. Like people who'd been alone in their houses had discovered, somewhat to their own surprise, that they were actually neighbors. That's what Linda had stolen. Not just from me, not just a strip of driveway, but from this entire neighborhood. The ordinary ease of being neighbors. The comfort of a place that feels genuinely yours. She'd stolen the ambient safety of a community that wasn't watching you with a clipboard. And the getting back of that thing, that was the real accounting. The criminal charges were justice. The neighborhood feeling ordinary again was the thing that mattered. Priya took me to dinner on November 15th to celebrate. She'd promised me a dinner once the anti-slap award was confirmed paid, which it was. Linda's attorney had transferred $31,400 to Priya's firm on November 10th. We went to a nice place in South Congress and drank very good wine and talked about everything except the case for most of the evening. Near the end, Priya said, "Can I tell you what I've been thinking about this?" I said, "Of course." She said, "You did something that most people don't do. Not because they can't, because they decide it's not worth it. And I've been doing this for 12 years and I still can't fully explain what makes one person decide it is worth it and another person decide it isn't." I thought about that. Then I said, "My mom's car and Mrs. Nguyen's door. It's always specific. It's always a person. That's what makes it worth it." Priya nodded. "Write that down somewhere," she said. "That's the thing. I want to tell you about a moment that happened in early December. I was in my driveway, actually in it, working on my truck, changing the oil, when a car slowed and pulled in behind me. I looked up. It was a woman I didn't recognize, maybe 40, in a practical sedan. She looked nervous. She said, "Are you Marcus Webb? I'm sorry to bother you. I read about what you did. My HOA is doing something similar and I didn't know what to do. Someone told me to come talk to you." I looked at her for a moment. The afternoon light was coming low across the driveway. I wiped my hands on a rag. I said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee. Tell me everything. And bring whatever documents you have." She came inside. Her name was Patricia Holt. Her HOA in Cedar Park had been refusing to approve a ramp modification for her disabled teenage son's wheelchair access, citing aesthetic guidelines. She'd been fighting it alone for 8 months. She had a folder of documents. I sat with her for 2 hours. I gave her Priya's number. I gave her Dr. Frost's number. I told her what I'd learned, methodically, practically, the way you tell someone how to navigate a system you've been through. By the time she left, she had a plan. She didn't have the outcome yet, but she had the map. That conversation, Patricia Holt's face going from closed and anxious to open and purposeful as she understood that there were tools and people and processes and that she was not alone. That conversation mattered to me more than almost anything else that had happened in the past year. Because that's what the fight had been building toward. Not just my driveway, not just my neighborhood. The map, handed forward. Christmas that year was my mom, staying for a full week. The first time she'd stayed more than a weekend in years. She parked in the driveway. No cone. No sign. Just her car in the spot I'd built for her, in the driveway that was mine, in the house that was mine, in the neighborhood that felt finally and genuinely like mine. She made jerk chicken and sweet potato pie and we watched old movies and she fell asleep on my couch on Christmas Eve and I put a blanket over her and stood in the quiet of my house and thought, This is what I was protecting. Not a principle. In January, the HOA held its first fully open annual election, properly noticed with candidate statements with a 60-day comment period, with online voting available for the first time. Every single incumbent on the new board ran and won, plus 2 new members including Henry Lamb, who had become, in the preceding months, one of the most competent and trustworthy people I'd encountered in this neighborhood. Carol Sims won re-election with 87% of the vote, the highest percentage in HOA history. I voted. I put my ballot in fully completed. That felt good. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, which I register only because of the timing, Linda Marsh reached a plea agreement with the Travis County DA's office. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of fraudulent misappropriation of nonprofit funds. In exchange, the unauthorized computer access and witness tampering charges were dropped. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, full restitution to the HOA Improvement Fund, $12,600, the total of both companies' payments, a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any Texas nonprofit, and a public apology to the Millfield Estates Homeowners Association. The public apology was Priya's negotiation, not the DA's requirement. Linda's plea agreement included a specific provision requiring her to deliver a written apology to the HOA membership within 30 days of sentencing. It had to be signed, unaltered, and sent to every resident on the HOA mailing list. Linda's attorney had pushed back on this hard, but Priya had held firm. She can accept the apology requirement or she can go to trial, Priya had said. She accepted the requirement. The apology arrived in my inbox on March 8th at 10:47 a.m. It was a single page. I read it once. It said, "I am writing to acknowledge that during my tenure as HOA president of Millfield Estates, I took actions that were not consistent with my fiduciary and ethical obligations to this community. I made financial decisions that constituted self-dealing and were improper. I applied enforcement inconsistently and at times unfairly. I am sorry for the harm caused to individual homeowners and to the community as a whole. I accept full responsibility for these actions." It was not abject. It was not warm. But it was real, signed, specific, on the record. It was the most honest thing Linda Marsh had ever said to this neighborhood. And she'd said it because she had no other choice. I sat with that letter for a while. I thought about what it meant that it had taken criminal charges and a plea agreement to produce an honest acknowledgement. I thought about how much easier all of this would have been, for everyone, including Linda, if she had simply operated with honesty and fairness from the beginning. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. I felt tired in the way that comes at the end of something very long. And under the tiredness, something quieter. The solid, settled feeling of a thing properly concluded. Brenda Howell, who was now on the HOA board, proposed framing a copy of the letter and putting it in the HOA's public records binder. She made this proposal at a board meeting very deadpan with a completely straight face. Carol Sims suppressed a smile and said it would go in the records binder without a frame, as all correspondence did. The motion was tabled. It was the funniest moment in HOA governance I'd ever witnessed. I am including it in this account because it is true and because it made me laugh, and I needed that. In the spring, almost exactly a year after Linda had put that orange cone in my driveway, the Nguyen's planted a new garden in their backyard. Mrs. Nguyen had been wanting to for years. She'd held off, partly out of the worry that any visible change to her property might trigger a review. Now she planted. She planted tomatoes and peppers and lemongrass and a climbing rose on the fence and something she called Rao Ram that grew in a clay pot and smelled wonderful. She showed it to me over the back fence one Sunday afternoon, proud and easy in a way that she hadn't been before. "It's mine," she said simply. "My yard, my garden." "Yes," I said. "It is." Summer came back around. Gary Marsh moved the boat. I don't know why. Maybe Linda had finally insisted, or maybe Gary had simply decided he was done with that chapter. But one morning in June, the boat trailer was gone from in front of their house, and the street in front of 16 Clover Ridge Lane was just a regular street again. I noticed it the way you notice when a piece of background noise you'd stopped hearing finally stops, with a small, quiet sense of clearing. The HUD inquiry concluded in the following fall, 15 months after Dr. Frost filed the initial complaint. The findings cited statistically significant disparate enforcement patterns under Linda's administration consistent with potential Fair Housing Act violations. No individual was criminally charged. The standard for criminal civil rights violations is very high, but HUD issued a formal compliance directive to the Millfield Estates HOA requiring adoption of written, race-neutral enforcement standards, mandatory training for board members, and a 2-year reporting period. The new board complied without objection. The directive was public record. The Nguyen's received a copy. I gave the TREC findings binder to Carol Sims when the regulatory case formally closed. It was 3 inches thick. Every filing, every response, every motion, every correspondence organized and tabbed. Carol held it with both hands and said, "What do I do with this?" I said, "Keep it. It's the record of how this neighborhood decided it was worth fighting for." She put it on the HOA's shelf in the clubhouse, next to the meeting minutes and the maintenance logs and the financial reports. That's where it belongs. Priya and I stayed in touch. She's now the attorney of record for 4 other HOA dispute cases in the Austin metro area. Residents who'd found her name through the Statesman article or through the network of people who'd come to me after the case concluded. She sends me updates occasionally. In shorthand, Cedar Park ramp case 1. Pflugerville fence case. Settled in favor. She's building the map from her side. I'm glad she is. I ran into Diane once the following spring at a grocery store in Westlake. We recognized each other across the produce section. There was a moment of uncertain possibility. She looked like she might say something, or I might, or we might both pretend we hadn't seen each other. Then she said, "Marcus." I said, "Diane." She said, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." I said, "I know." We said goodbye and went our separate ways through the grocery store. That was all. It was enough. Tom Albright listed his house in Birchwood Court for sale in March. It sold in 12 days, the market, not the HOA, working in his favor. He moved to somewhere outside Dallas, I was told. His house is now owned by a young couple with 2 enormous dogs. The dogs are not compliant with HOA pet size guidelines, but the guidelines have since been revised to remove the weight limit, which was, on review, an arbitrary restriction with no clear community benefit. The dogs are very friendly. Their names are Biscuit and Duke. I know this because they got loose once and showed up in my backyard looking expectant. I gave them water. Good dogs. On a Tuesday morning in the following fall, October, 2 years after the cone, I was sitting on my porch with coffee when my phone rang. Caller ID said it was the Travis County Courthouse. I answered. It was a notification. Linda Marsh's probation had been extended by 6 months due to a delay in completing her community service hours. The notification was routine. I was a listed party in the case and received all court notifications automatically. I noted it. I set my phone down. I drank my coffee. The morning was cool and clear, the way Austin mornings get in October before they forget they're supposed to be fall. My truck was in the driveway. My mom's spot was open, waiting for her next visit. I want to be clear about something as I come toward the end of this account. I did not win because I was the hero of this story. I won because I kept records, because Priya was brilliant, because Carol had the courage to go on record, because Derek kept a thumb drive, because Gary Marsh's conscience, prodded by his sister, moved him to cooperate, because Brenda Howell made a spreadsheet, because Mrs. Nguyen told the truth about a phone call she'd never forgotten, because Camille Torres did real journalism, because Detective Chun ran a real investigation, because the Texas Real Estate Commission did its job, because 32 years of Mrs. Nguyen's patience and dignity and presence in this neighborhood made her testimony impossible to dismiss. It was a collective thing. I was the person who started making the map. The rest of the neighborhood filled it in. I still live at 14 Clover Ridge Lane. I still have a Silverado, still have a 2-car driveway, still widen the left side for my mom. The herb garden is thriving. The truck needs new tires. The Nguyen's climbing rose went over the fence this past spring and is now technically encroaching on my yard, and I find that I don't mind at all. If anything, I water it when Mrs. Nguyen's away. Community works like that when it's working. Crosses the lines you thought were fixed and turns out you didn't need them as strict as you thought. Linda Marsh completed her probation, extended term and all, the following year. She did not return to Millfield Estates. She and Gary moved to a newer development in the Hill Country, one of those places with a different HOA. I do not know what role, if any, she plays in that community. I hope she learned something. I believe in the possibility of people learning things, even people who have done significant harm. Whether she did or not is not my accounting to keep. Mine is closed. But the parking lesson, the one she gave me when she put that cone in my driveway, and the one I gave her over the long year that followed, turned out to be this: power that is not accountable will always eventually meet someone with enough patience and enough love for their place in the world to hold the line. Linda had miscounted when she saw me blinking in the driveway with my groceries going warm. She'd seen someone who would bend. She'd been wrong. Not because I was special. Because I had a driveway my mother used, and a neighbor's door I still remembered, and a city I lived in, and a street I called home. That's enough. It's always enough. You just have to decide it is. The sentencing hearing was held on February 14th, as noted, but I want to tell you what the courtroom was like. It was small and formal in the way of county courtrooms. Wood paneling, American flag, the judge elevated slightly above everyone. There were maybe 20 people in the gallery. I recognized Camille Torres. I recognized Carol Sims, who had come quietly and sat in the back row with her hands folded. I recognized Mrs. Nguyen. I hadn't known she was coming, and when I saw her, something in my chest moved. She saw me and nodded, the small, composed nod of someone who has been through something and come out the other side still standing. Linda stood when the judge addressed her. Her attorney stood beside her. The judge read the terms of the plea agreement, asked Linda to confirm her understanding, asked the prosecution to confirm the state's acceptance. Everything was formal and procedural and real. When the judge asked Linda if she had anything to say before sentencing, Linda's attorney started to speak. Linda stopped him. She said, directly to the judge, not to the gallery, not to us. I understand the harm I caused. I accept the consequences. 6 words into a sentence, 11 words total. Not an apology. Not an excuse. Just acknowledgement and acceptance, delivered in the same straight-backed, composed voice she'd used at every HOA meeting. The judge nodded. The gavel came down. Done. The restitution to the HOA Improvement Fund was processed within 60 days. $12,600 transferred back, publicly documented, to the fund it had been taken from. Carol Sims presented the restored balance at the next HOA member meeting. The neighborhood received a note from the board explaining what the money had been, where it had gone, and that it was now returned. No editorial. No triunfalism. Just the accounting done correctly. I found the moment of Linda's actual departure from the neighborhood, the physical departure, the moving truck, oddly anticlimactic. I happened to be outside when the truck arrived at her house. I watched it from across the yard without making any acknowledgement of it. She supervised the loading with the same organizational precision she'd brought to everything. Gary was there too, quieter. At one point, Linda looked up from whatever she was directing and our eyes met across the distance. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked away and went back to her work. That was it. No gesture, no parting shot, no final presentation. Just the practical business of leaving. After the truck pulled away and the house at 16, Clover Ridge Lane sat empty for the first time in years, I walked over and stood at the end of their driveway. I don't know why. I wasn't going to do anything. I just wanted to see it from that angle. From the perspective of the street, the house was just a house. No sign, no cone, no clipboard. Nothing that made it different from any of the others on the block. It looked like what it was. A place where people had lived, and now they were gone and someone else would come. That's how neighborhoods work. People come and go, and the place holds what it holds, and you put your name on the mailbox and you figure out if you're going to be a neighbor or a warden. Linda had chosen warden. The house didn't remember her choice. The neighborhood did. That's the difference. The new owners of 16 Clover Ridge Lane moved in the following spring. A young family, 2 adults, 3 kids, a golden retriever whose exuberance made even grumpy Mr. Peterson smile when it barreled through the neighborhood on walks. They introduced themselves at the door with homemade banana bread. They did not know the history of the house. They just moved in and started living. I helped them carry a couch. That's enough. That's the right way to start in a place. I want to tell you about the moment that felt most like closure. Not the legal conclusion, not the apology letter, not any of the official documented things. It was a Saturday morning in April, a year and a half after the cone. I was repaving a crack in my driveway with patching compound. A small maintenance job, something I'd been putting off. My mom was visiting. She was sitting on the porch with her coffee, watching me work, the way she does. The morning was warm and bright, the neighborhood coming alive around us. A kid on a bike, the Nguyen's garden visible over the fence, the sound of Henry Lamb's lawnmower a couple streets over. My mom said, from the porch, "You know what, that driveway looks good." I looked up. I said, "Yeah." She said, "Worth it?" I thought about it for a real moment. Not rhetorically, actually thought about it. The $15,000, the months, the anxiety, the depositions, the 4M spreadsheets, the thing I'd put my neighbors through by asking them to stand up. I thought about Mrs. Nguyen's door and Patricia Holt's ramp and the 3 votes in 42 minutes. I said, "Yes." She said, "I know." She sipped her coffee. I went back to patching the driveway. The morning continued. Everything was fine. Here is what I know after all of it. Bullies with institutional power are not different in kind from bullies without it. They are just harder to document. They have more tools, more procedures, more language to make their power look like principle. But they are the same underneath, the same need to control, to diminish, to be the most important person in every room they enter. And they are defeatable with the same tools that always defeat bullies. Patience, solidarity, and the willingness to tell the truth about what is happening, out loud, in writing, on the record, for as long as it takes. That's the parking lesson. Linda came to teach me about easements and property law and who was in charge of this neighborhood. What she taught me instead was this: you have more power than you think, and so does the person across the street from you, and the one 2 doors down, and the one who cried on their steps over a door. You have more power than you think when you stop carrying it alone. My driveway is mine. My mother parks there. She has a bad hip, and the extra width means she doesn't have to walk the street incline, and that matters, and that is enough of a reason to have done everything I did. I would do it again. I would start it sooner. I would not wait for permission to object to things that are wrong, and I would trust my neighbors sooner, and I would call Priya sooner, and I would file the first document sooner. The lesson is not to be strategic earlier, the lesson is to trust earlier. To trust that this place you've put your name on and your money into and your years into is worth protecting. It is. It always is. There are people on Clover Ridge Lane who go out of their way to say hello to me now when we pass. Not because I'm some kind of hero, I'm the IT guy who kept a really good spreadsheet, but because something happened here and people know I was part of it and they're glad it happened and they want to say so. Mrs. Nguyen brings me food sometimes. Brenda brings food all the time. Mr. Peterson nods at me with the particular gravity of someone who has lived long enough to take a good outcome seriously. These are my neighbors. I know their names. I know their dogs' names. I know what Mrs. Nguyen's garden smells like on a warm evening. That is what I have that I didn't fully have before. That is what Linda couldn't take and didn't understand she was protecting when she tried to take everything else. I'm going to tell you one last thing about Linda Marsh because I think it matters and because I think it's true. She was not a stupid person. She was intelligent and organized and capable of genuine administrative competence. She had real skills. In a different context, with different choices, she might have been an excellent HOA president, the kind who actually improves things, who advocates for the community, who uses institutional authority in the service of the people who granted it. She had the tools for that. She chose not to use them that way. And that choice, made incrementally, justified each time with something that probably sounded reasonable inside her own head. That choice is what brought her here, to a plea agreement and a restitution order and a permanent bar from nonprofit leadership in the state of Texas. I don't say this to be compassionate toward her. I say it because I think it's important to understand that the path she walked isn't walked only by monsters. It's walked by ordinary people who decide, repeatedly and at each available juncture, to prioritize control over service. That's what to watch for. That's what to name when you see it. The herb garden is coming in strong this season. The rosemary has gotten enthusiastic and the basil is showing off. The comfort mint my mom planted is now colonizing one entire corner of the patio bed, which is exactly what mint does, and I have decided to let it, because some things should be allowed to grow without restriction. The truck is parked in the driveway. The spot beside it is ready. In the months after Linda's departure and the conclusion of the legal proceedings, Millfield Estates did something I hadn't entirely expected. It healed. Not dramatically, not all at once, not completely, that's not how neighborhoods work. But steadily and in small observable ways it healed. The common area was re-landscaped in March, this time with community input. Carol held an open session where residents could suggest plantings, and the result was a slightly chaotic but genuinely beloved combination of native wildflowers and the same ornamental grasses that had always been there. The gate at the entrance got new keypad hardware. The pool hours were extended by 2 hours on weekdays. These were small things. They were the right things. The HOA Improvement Fund, restored and now publicly reported quarterly, was used in its first year under the new board to fund the landscaping update, a new pressure washer for the community clubhouse, practical, unglamorous, much needed, and a small grant program for low-income homeowners needing minor exterior repairs that might otherwise result in citation violations. The grant program was Brenda's idea. It was her finest moment in governance, in my opinion, though I told her it was a close race with the lemon pound cake. Mrs. Nguyen was invited to present to the new Architectural Review Board about the variance request process. Specifically, about what the experience of applying for a variance under the old administration had felt like, and what changes would make it more navigable. She accepted. She spoke for 20 minutes in her clear, measured English, describing exactly what she had experienced, including the phone call. The board listened without interruption. When she finished, Carol said, "Thank you, Mrs. Nguyen. We will do better." Mrs. Nguyen said, "I know. That's why I came." That exchange is in the HOA minutes. I read it 3 times when Carol sent me a copy. Dr. Frost's civil rights work continued beyond the Millfield Estates case. The HUD inquiry, combined with the documented enforcement patterns from our case, contributed to a broader state-level review of HOA enforcement practices that the Texas legislature was considering in its next session. I don't know if that review will produce legislation. These things take time. But the case is in the record. The data is in the record. The map is longer now than it was. Camille Torres won a regional journalism award for her coverage of the case. She gave a brief acceptance speech that mentioned, specifically, the role that documented records and community solidarity had played in making the story possible to report. She said, "The sources who came forward in this case did so because one person made it safe to. That's how journalism works, and it's how accountability works. One person decides to start the map. I wasn't there to hear it, but she sent me the video. I watched it twice. My life continued in the ways that lives continue after the extraordinary becomes ordinary again. I got a promotion at work, a long overdue step up to principal engineer, which came with a salary increase that offset most of what I'd spent on the case. I adopted a cat from the Austin shelter, a very opinionated orange tabby I named Easement, which everyone finds either very funny or very strange, and both reactions are acceptable to me. I went camping in Big Bend in the fall, my first real trip in 2 years. I stood on the rim at dusk with the desert going purple and red below me, and I thought about nothing in particular, which is a luxury I'd forgotten I was allowed. On the second anniversary of the morning Linda put that cone in my driveway, I woke up early, before the alarm, before the sun was fully up. I made coffee and took it to the porch and sat in the cool dark of a February morning, watching Clover Ridge Lane come slowly into light. The street was quiet. Mr. Peterson's porch light was on, the way it always is in the early morning. The Nguyen's climbing rose, which had made it through another winter, was putting out the first cautious green of a new growing season over the fence. My truck sat in the driveway, solid and familiar. My mom's spot was open beside it. I sat there for a while and I thought about what it means to own a place. Not legally. Legally I knew the answer. I had it in 32 pages of regulatory findings and a title that read clear and clean. I mean what it means in the way that actually matters. To put your years into something, to fix its cracks and plant its edges and widen its driveway for the person you love. To call it yours not as a claim of ownership but as a declaration of belonging. To choose it every morning as the place where you are home. Linda had tried to redefine my belonging. She had failed. Not because the law had stopped her, though the law had stopped her, but because belonging doesn't require anyone else's permission. You belong where you have put your love. I had put mine here, steadily and without fanfare, for 7 years. It was still here. So was I. The morning brightened. The neighborhood woke up around me in its ordinary, unremarkable, completely precious way. Somewhere a kid's bike scraped concrete. Car backed out. The Nguyen's kitchen light came on, warm and yellow. I finished my coffee. I went inside. I had a normal day. That's the whole point. That's everything.